This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, August 2nd, 1907. Chapters from my Autobiography, Chapter 21, by Mark Twain. From Susie's Biography of Me, February 12, 1886. Mama and I have both been very troubled of late because Papa, since he had been publishing General Grant's book, has seemed to forget his own books and work entirely, and the other evening, as Papa and I were promenading up and down the library, he told me that he didn't expect to write but one more book, and then he was ready to give up work altogether, die, or do anything. He said that he had written more than he had ever expected to, and the only book that he had been particularly anxious to write was one locked up in the safe downstairs, not yet published. Note, it isn't yet. Title of it, Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven. S.L.C. But this intended future, of course, will never do, and although Papa usually holds to his own opinions and intents with outsiders, when Mama really desires anything and says that it must be, Papa always gives up his plans, at least so far, and does as she says is right, and she is usually right, if she disagrees with him at all. It was because he knew his great tendency to being convinced by her that he published without her knowledge that article in the Christian Union concerning the government of children. So, judging by the proofs of past years, I think that we will be able to persuade Papa to go back to work as before, and not leave off writing with the end of his next story. Mama says that she sometimes feels, and I do too, that she would rather have Papa depend on his writing for a living than to have him think of giving it up. Dictated November 8th, 1906. I have a defect of a sort which I think is not common. Certainly I hope it isn't. It is rare that I can call before my mind's eye the form and face of either friend or enemy. If I should make a list, now, of persons whom I know in America and abroad, say to the number of even an entire 1,000, it is quite unlikely that I could reproduce 5 of them in my mind's eye. Of my dearest and most intimate friends, I could name 8 of whom I have seen and talked with 4 days ago, but when I try to call them before me, they are formless shadows. Jean has been absent this past 8 or 10 days in the country, and I wish I could reproduce her in the mirror of my mind, but I can't do it. It may be that this defect is not constitutional, but a result of lifelong absence of mind and indolent and inadequate observation. Once or twice in my life it has been an embarrassment to me. 20 years ago, in the days of Susie's biography of me, there was a dispute one morning at the breakfast table about the color of a neighbor's eyes. I was asked for a verdict, but had to confess that if that valued neighbor and old friend had eyes, I was not sure that I had ever seen them. It was then mockingly suggested that perhaps I didn't even know the color of the eyes of my own family, and I was required to shut my own at once and testify. I was able to name the color of Mrs. Clemens' eyes, but was not able to even suggest a color for Jean's or Clara's or Susie's. All this talk is suggested by Susie's remark the other evening as Papa and I were promenading up and down the library. Down to the bottom of my heart I am thankful that I can see that picture, and it is not dim, but stands out clear in the unfaded light of 21 years ago. In those days Susie and I used to promenade daily up and down the library, with our arms about each other's waists, and deal in intimate communion concerning affairs of state, or the deep questions of human life, or our small personal affairs. It was quite natural that I should think I had written myself out when I was only 50 years old, for everybody who has ever written has been smitten with that superstition at about that age. Not even yet have I really written myself out. I have merely stopped writing because dictating is pleasanter work, and because dictating has given me a strong aversion to the pen, and because 2 hours of talking per day is enough, and because... But I am only damaging my mind with this digging around in it for pretexts where no pretext is needed, and where the simple truth is for this one time better than any invention in this small emergency. I shall never finish my 5 or 6 unfinished books, for the reason that by 40 years of slavery to the pen I have earned my freedom. I detest the pen, and I wouldn't use it again to sign the death warrant of my dearest enemy. Dictated March 8, 1906. For 30 years I have received an average of a dozen letters a year from strangers who remember me or whose fathers remember me as boy and young man. But these letters are almost always disappointing. I have not known these strangers nor their fathers. I have not heard of the names they mention. The reminiscences to which they call attention have had no part in my experience, all of which means that these strangers have been mistaking me for somebody else. But at last I have the refreshment, this morning, of a letter from a man who deals in names that were familiar to me in my boyhood. The writer encloses a newspaper clipping which has been wandering through the press for 4 or 5 weeks, and he wants to know if Captain Tongcray, lately deceased, was, as stated in the clipping, the original of Huckleberry Finn. I have replied that Huckleberry Finn was Frank F. As this inquirer evidently knew the Hannibal of the 40s, he will easily recall Frank. Frank's father was at one time town drunkard, an exceedingly well-defined and unofficial office of those days. He succeeded General Gaines, and for a time he was sole and only incumbent of the office, but afterward Jimmy Finn proved competency and disputed the place with him. So we had 2 town drunkards at one time, and it made as much trouble in that village as Christendom experienced in the 14th century when there were 2 popes at the same time. In Huckleberry Finn I have drawn Frank exactly as he was. He was ignorant, unwashed, insufficiently fed, but he had as good a heart as ever any boy had. His liberties were totally unrestricted. He was the only really independent person, boy or man, in the community, and by consequence he was tranquilly and continuously happy, and was envied by all the rest of us. We liked him. We enjoyed his society. And as his society was forbidden us by our parents, the prohibition trebled and quadrupled its value, and therefore we sought and got more of his society than of any other boy's. I heard 4 years ago that he was justice of the peace in a remote village in the state of blank, and was a good citizen, and was greatly respected. During Jimmy Finn's term, he, Jimmy, was not exclusive. He was not finical. He was not hypercritical. He was largely and handsomely democratic, and slept in the deserted tan yard with the hogs. My father tried to reform him once, but did not succeed. My father was not a professional reformer. In him the spirit of reform was spasmodic. It only broke out now and then, with considerable intervals between. Once he tried to reform Injun Joe. That also was a failure. It was a failure, and we boys were glad, for Injun Joe drunk was interesting and a benefaction to us, but Injun Joe sober was a dreary spectacle. We watched my father's experiments upon him with a good deal of anxiety, but it came out all right, and we were satisfied. Injun Joe got drunk oftener than before, and became intolerably interesting. I think that in Tom Sawyer I starved Injun Joe to death in the cave, but that may have been to meet the exigencies of romantic literature. I can't remember now whether the real Injun Joe died in the cave or out of it, but I do remember that the news of his death reached me at a most unhappy time, that is to say, just at bedtime on a summer night, when a prodigious storm of thunder and lightning, accompanied by a deluging rain that turned the streets and lanes into rivers, caused me to repent and resolve to lead a better life. I can remember those awful thunderbursts and the white glare of the lightning yet, and the wild lashing of the rain against the window-panes. By my teachings I perfectly well knew what all that wild riot was for. Satan had come to get Injun Joe. I had no shadow of doubt about it. It was the proper thing when a person like Injun Joe was required in the underworld, and I should have thought it strange and unaccountable if Satan had come for him in a less impressive way. With every glare of lightning I shriveled and shrunk together in mortal terror, and in the interval of black darkness that followed I poured out my lamentings over my lost condition, and my supplications for just one more chance, with an energy and feeling and sincerity quite foreign to my nature. But in the morning I saw that it was a false alarm, and concluded to resume business at the old stand and wait for another reminder. The axiom says, history repeats itself. A week or two ago Mr. Blank dined with us, At dinner he mentioned a circumstance which flashed me back over about 60 years and landed me in that little bedroom on that tempestuous night, and brought to my mind how creditable to me was my conduct through the whole night, and how barren it was of moral spot or fleck during that entire period. He said Mr. X was sexton or something of the Episcopal Church in his town, and had been for many years the competent superintendent of all the church's worldly affairs, and was regarded by the whole congregation as a stay, a blessing, a priceless treasure. But he had a couple of defects. Not large defects, but they seemed large when flung against the background of his profoundly religious character. He drank a good deal, and he could outswear a brakeman. A movement arose to persuade him to lay aside these vices, and after consulting with his pal, who occupied the same position as himself in the other Episcopal Church, and whose defects were duplicates of his own and had inspired regret in the congregation he was serving, they concluded to try for reform, not wholesale, but half at a time. They took the liquor pledge and waited for results. During 9 days the results were entirely satisfactory, and they were recipients of many compliments and much congratulation. Then on New Year's Eve they had business a mile and a half out of town, just beyond the state line. Everything went well with them that evening in the bar-room of the inn, but at last the celebration of the occasion by those villagers came to be of a burdensome nature. It was a bitter cold night, and the multitudinous hot toddies that were circulating began by and by to exert a powerful influence upon the new prohibitionists. At last X's friend remarked, "X, does it occur to you that we are outside the diocese?" That ended Reform Number 1. Then they took a chance in Reform Number 2. For a while that one prospered, and they got much applause. I now reach the incident which sent me back a matter of 60 years, as I have remarked a while ago. One morning Mr. met X on the street and said, "You have made a gallant struggle against those defects of yours. I am aware that you failed on Number 1, but I am also aware that you are having better luck with Number 2. "Yes," X said, "Number 2 is all right and sound up to date, and we are full of hope." Said, "X, of course you have troubles like other people, but they never show on the outside. I have never seen you when you are not cheerful. Are you always cheerful? Really always cheerful?" "Well, no," he said. "No, I can't say that I am always cheerful, but, well, you know that kind of a night that comes. Say you wake up way in the night and the whole world is sunk in gloom, and there are storms and earthquakes and all sorts of disasters in the air threatening, and you get cold and clammy, and when that happens to me I recognize how sinful I am, and it all goes clear to my heart and wrings it, and I have such terrors and terrors. Oh, they are indescribable, those terrors that assail me. And I slip out of bed and get on my knees and pray and promise that I will be good if I can only have another chance. And then, you know, in the morning the sun shines out so lovely, and the birds sing, and the whole world is so beautiful, and, b'God, I rally." Now I will quote a brief paragraph from this letter which I have a minute ago spoken of. The writer says, "You no doubt are at a loss to know who I am. I will tell you. In my younger days I was a resident of Hannibal, Missouri, and you and I were schoolmates attending Mr. Dawson's school along with Sam and Will Bowen and Andy Fuqua and others whose names I have forgotten. I was then about the smallest boy in school for my age, and they called me Little Aleck for short. I only dimly remember him, but I knew those other people as well as I knew the town drunkards. I remember Dawson's schoolhouse perfectly. If I wanted to describe it, I could save myself the trouble by conveying the description of it to these pages from Tom Sawyer. I can remember the drowsy and inviting summer sounds that used to float in through the open windows from that distant boy paradise, Cardiff Hill, Holliday's Hill, and mingle with the murmurs of the studying pupils, and make them the more dreary by the contrast. I remember Andy Fuqua, the oldest pupil, a man of 25. I remember the youngest pupil, Nanny Owsley, a child of 7. I remember George Robards, 18 or 20 years old, the only pupil who studied Latin. I remember in some cases vividly, in others vaguely, the rest of the 25 boys and girls. I remember Mr. Dawson very well. I remember his boy Theodore, who was as good as he could be. In fact, he was inordinately good, extravagantly good, offensively good, detestably good. and he had pop eyes, and I would have drowned him if I had had a chance. In that school we were all about on an equality, and, so far as I remember, the passion of envy had no place in our hearts except in the case of Arch Fuqua, the other one's brother. Of course we all went barefoot in the summer-time. Arch Fuqua was about my own age, 10 or 11. In the winter we could stand him because he wore shoes then, and his great gift was hidden from our sight and we were enabled to forget it. But in the summer-time he was a bitterness to us. He was our envy, for he could double back his big toe and let it fly, and you could hear a snap 30 yards. There was not another boy in the school that could approach this feat. He had not a rival as regards a physical distinction, except in Theodore Eddy, who could work his ears like a horse. But he was no real rival, because you couldn't hear him work his ears, so all the advantage lay with Arch Fuqua. I am not done with Dawson's School. I will return to it in a later chapter. Dictated at Hamilton, Bermuda, January 6, 1907. That reminds me. In conversation we are always using that phrase, and seldom or never noticing how large a significance it bears. It stands for a curious and interesting fact, to wit, that sleeping or waking, dreaming or talking, the thoughts which swarm through our heads are almost constantly, almost continuously, accompanied by a like swarm of reminders of incidents and episodes of our past. A man can never know what a large traffic this commerce of association carries on in our minds until he sets out to write his autobiography. He then finds that a thought is seldom born to him that does not immediately remind him of some event, large or small, in his past experience. Quite naturally these remarks remind me of various things, among others this, that sometimes a thought, by the power of association, will bring back to your mind a lost word or a lost name, which you have not been able to recover by any other process known to your mental equipment. Yesterday we had an instance of this. Reverend Joseph H. Twitchell is with me on this flying trip to Bermuda. He was with me on my last visit to Bermuda, and today we are trying to remember when it was. We thought it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 years ago, but that was as near as we could get at the date. Twitchell said that the landlady in whose boarding house we sojourned in that ancient time could doubtly furnish us the date, and we must look her up. We wanted to see her anyway, because she and her blooming daughter of 18 were the only persons whose acquaintance we had made at that time, for we were traveling under fictitious names, and people who wear aliases are not given to seeking society and bringing themselves under suspicion. But at this point in our talk we encountered an obstruction. We could not recall the landlady's name. We hunted all around through our minds for that name, using all the customary methods of research, but without success. The name was gone from us, apparently permanently. We finally gave the matter up and fell to talking about something else. The talk wandered from one subject to another and finally arrived at Twitchell's school days in Hartford, the Hartford of something more than half a century ago, and he mentioned several of his schoolmasters, dwelling with special interest upon the peculiarities of an aged one named Olney. He remarked that Olney, humble village schoolmaster as he was yet a man of superior parts, and had published textbooks which had enjoyed a wide currency in America in their day. I said I remembered those books, and had studied Olney's geography in school when I was a boy. Then Twitchell said, "That reminds me. Our landlady's name was a name that was associated with school books of some kind or other 50 or 60 years ago. I wonder what it was. I believe it began with a K." Association did the rest, and did it instantly. I said, "Kirkham's Grammar." That settled it. Kirkham was the name, and we went out to seek for the owner of it. There was no trouble about that, for Bermuda is not large, and is like the earlier Garden of Eden, in that everybody in it knows everybody else, just as it was in the Serpent's headquarters in Adam's time. We easily found Miss Kirkham, she that had been the blooming girl of a generation before, and she was still keeping boarders, but her mother had passed from this life. She settled the date for us, and did it with certainty, by help of a couple of uncommon circumstances, events of that ancient time. She said we had sailed from Bermuda on the 24th of May, 1877, which was the day on which her only nephew was born, and he is now 30 years of age. The other unusual circumstance, she called it an unusual circumstance, and I didn't say anything, was that on that day the Reverend Mr. Twitchell, bearing the assumed name of Peters, had made a statement to her which she regarded as a fiction. I remembered the circumstance very well. We had bidden the young girl good-bye, and had gone 50 yards, perhaps, when Twitchell said he had forgotten something. I doubted it, and must go back. When he rejoined me he was silent, and this alarmed me, because I had not seen an example of it before. He seemed quite uncomfortable, and I asked him what the trouble was. He said he had been inspired to give the girl a pleasant surprise, and so had gone back and said to her, "That young fellow's name is not Wilkinson. That's Mark Twain." She did not lose her mind. She did not exhibit any excitement at all, but said quite simply, quite tranquilly, "Tell it to the Marines, Mr. Peters, if that should happen to be your name." It was very pleasant to meet her again. We were white-headed, but she was not. In the sweet and unvexed spiritual atmosphere of the Bermudas one does not achieve gray hairs at 48. I had a dream last night, and of course it was born of association, like nearly everything else that drifts into a person's head, asleep or awake. On board ship, on the passage down, Twitchell was talking about the swiftly developing possibilities of serial navigation, and he quoted those striking verses of Tennyson's which forecast a future when airborne vessels of war shall meet and fight above the clouds and redden the earth below with a rain of blood. This picture of carnage and blood and death reminded me of something which I had read a fortnight ago, statistics of railway accidents compiled by the United States government, wherein the appalling fact was set forth that on our 200,000 miles of railway we annually kill 10,000 persons outright and injure 80,000. The warships in the air suggested the railway horrors, and 3 nights afterwards the railway horrors suggested my dream. The work of association was going on in my head unconsciously all that time. It was an admirable dream, what there was of it. In it I saw a funeral procession. I saw it from a mountain peak. I saw it crawling along and curving here and there, serpent-like, through a level, vast plain. I seemed to see 100 miles of the procession, but neither the beginning of it nor the end of it was within the limits of my vision. The procession was in 10 divisions, each division marked by a somber flag, and the whole represented 10 years of our railway activities in the accident time. Each division was composed of 80,000 cripples, and was bearing its own years, 10,000 mutilated corpses to the grave. In the aggregate, 800,000 cripples and 100,000 dead, drenched in blood. Mark Twain. To be continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, Chapters from My Autobiography, Chapter 22, by Mark Twain. Dictated October 10th, 1906. Susie has named a number of the friends who were assembled at Onteiro at the time of our visit, but there were others, among them Lawrence Hutton, Charles Dudley Warner, and Carol Beckwith and their wives. It was a bright and jolly company. Some of those choice spirits are still with us. The others have passed from this life. Mrs. Clemens, Susie, Mr. Warner, Mary Mapes Dodge, Lawrence Hutton, Dean Sage, peace to their ashes. Susie is in error in thinking Mrs. Dodge was not there at that time. We were her guests. We arrived at nightfall, dreary from a tiresome journey, but the dreariness did not last. Mrs. Dodge had provided a home-made banquet, and the happy company sat down to it, 20 strong or more. Then the thing happened which always happens at large dinners, and is always exasperating. Everybody talked to his elbow-mates, and all talked at once, and gradually raised their voices higher and higher and higher in the desperate effort to be heard. It was like a riot, an insurrection. It was an intolerable volume of noise. Presently I said to the lady next to me, "I will subdue this riot. I will silence this racket. There is only one way to do it, but I know the art. You must tilt your head toward mine, and seem to be deeply interested in what I am saying. I will talk in a low voice. Then, just because our neighbors won't be able to hear me, they will want to hear me. If I mumble long enough, say 2 minutes, you will see that the dialogues will one after another come to a standstill, and there will be silence, not a sound anywhere but my mumbling." Then in a very low voice I began, When I went out to Chicago 11 years ago to witness the Grant festivities, there was a great banquet on the first night, with 600 ex-soldiers present. The gentleman who sat next to me was Mr. XX. He was very hard of hearing, and he had a habit common to deaf people of shouting his remarks instead of delivering them in an ordinary voice. He would handle his knife and fork in reflective silence for 5 or 6 minutes at a time, and then suddenly fetch out a shout that would make you jump out of the United States. By this time the insurrection at Mrs. Dodge's table, at least that part of it in my immediate neighborhood, had died down, and the silence was spreading, couple by couple, down the long table. I went on in a lower and still lower mumble, and most impressively. During one of Mr. XX's mute intervals, a man opposite us approached the end of a story which he had been telling his elbow neighbor. He was speaking in a low voice. There was much noise. I was deeply interested, and straining my ears to catch his words, stretching my neck, holding my breath, to hear, unconscious of everything but the fascinating tale. I heard him say, "At this point he seized her by her long hair. She, shrieking and begging, bent her neck across his knee, and with one awful sweep of the razor—" "How do you like Chicago?" That was XX's interruption, hearable at 30 miles. By the time I had reached that place in my mumblings, Mrs. Dodge's dining room was so silent, so breathlessly still, that if you had dropped a thought anywhere in it, you could have heard it smack the floor. Note: this was tried. I will remember it. M.T., October, '06. When I delivered that yell, the entire dinner company jumped as one person and punched their heads through the ceiling, damaging it, for it was only lath and plaster. And it all came down on us, and much of it went into the victuals, and made them gritty, but no one was hurt. Then I explained why it was that I had played that game, and begged them to take the moral of it home to their hearts, and be rational and merciful thenceforth, and cease from screaming in mass, and agree to let one person talk at a time, and the rest listen in grateful and unvexed peace. They granted my prayer, and we had a happy time all the rest of the evening. I do not think I have ever had a better time in my life. This was largely because the new terms enabled me to keep the floor, now that I had it, and do all the talking myself. I do like to hear myself talk. Susie has exposed this in her biography of me. Dean Sage was a delightful man, yet in one way a terror to his friends, for he loved them so well that he could not refrain from playing practical jokes on them. We have to be pretty deeply in love with a person before we can do him the honor of joking familiarly with him. Dean Sage was the best citizen I have known in America. It takes courage to be a good citizen, and he had plenty of it. He allowed no individual and no corporation to infringe his smallest right and escape unpunished. He was very rich, and very generous, and benevolent, and he gave away his money with a prodigal hand. But if an individual or corporation infringed a right of his to the value of 10 cents, he would spend thousands of dollars' worth of time and labor and money and persistence on the matter, and would not lower his flag until he had won his battle or lost it. He and Reverend Mr. Harris had been classmates in college, and to the day of Sage's death they were as fond of each other as an engaged pair. It follows without saying that whenever Sage found an opportunity to play a joke upon Harris, Harris was sure to suffer. Along about 1873 Sage fell a victim to an illness which reduced him to a skeleton, and defied all the efforts of the physicians to cure it. He went to the Adirondacks and took Harris with him. Sage had always been an active man, and he couldn't idle any day wholly away in inanition, but walked every day to the limit of his strength. One day, toward nightfall, the pair came upon a humble log cabin which bore these words painted upon a shingle: "Entertainment for man and beast." They were obliged to stop there for the night, Sage's strength being exhausted. They entered the cabin and found its owner and sole occupant there, a rugged and sturdy and simple-hearted man of middle age. He cooked supper and placed it before the travelers: salt junk, boiled beans, corn bread, and black coffee. Sage's stomach could abide nothing but the most delicate food. Therefore this banquet revolted him, and he sat at the table unemployed, while Harris fed ravenously, limitlessly, gratefully. For he had been chaplain in a fighting regiment all through the war, and had kept in perfection the grand and uncritical appetite and splendid physical vigor which those 4 years of tough fare and activity had furnished him. Sage went supperless to bed, and tossed and writhed all night upon a shuck mattress that was full of attentive and interested corn-cobs. In the morning Harris was ravenous again, and devoured the odious breakfast as constantly and as delightedly as he had devoured its twin the night before. Sage sat upon the porch, empty, and contemplated the performance and meditated revenge. Presently he beckoned to the landlord and took him aside and had a confidential talk with him. He said, "I am the paymaster. What is the bill?" "2 suppers, 50 cents, 2 beds, 30 cents, 2 breakfasts, 50 cents, total $1.30. Sage said, "Go back and make out the bill and fetch it to me here on the porch. Make it $13. $13? Why, it's impossible. I am no robber. I am charging you what I charge everybody. It's $1.30, and that's all it is. My man, I've got something to say about this as well as you. It's $13. You'll make out your bill for that, and you'll take it, too, or you'll not get a cent." The man was troubled and said, "I don't understand this. I can't make it out." "Well, I understand it. I know what I am about. It's $13, and I want the bill made out for that. There's no other terms. Get it ready and bring it out here. I will examine it and be outraged. You understand? I will dispute the bill. You must stand to it. You must refuse to take less. I will begin to lose my temper. You must begin to lose yours. I will call you hard names, and you must answer with harder ones. I will raise my voice, and you must raise yours. You must go into a rage. Foam at the mouth if you can. Insert some soap to help it along. Now go along and follow your instructions." The man played his assigned part and played it well. He brought the bill and stood waiting for results. Sage's face began to cloud up, his eyes to snap, and his nostrils to inflate like a horse's. Then he broke out with, $13? You mean to say that you charge $13 for these damned inhuman hospitalities of yours? Are you a professional buccaneer? Is it your custom to—" The man burst in with spirit. "Now, I don't want any more out of you. That's a plenty. This bill is $13, and you'll pay it. That's all. A couple of characterless adventurers bilking their way through this country and attempting to dictate terms to a gentleman who received you, supposing you were gentlemen yourselves, whereas, in my opinion, hell's full of—" Sage broke in, "Not another word of that. I won't have it. I regard you as the lowest-down thief that ever—" "Don't you use that word again. By, I'll take you by the neck and—" Harris came rushing out, and just as the two were about to grapple he pushed himself between them and began to implore, "Oh, Dean, don't. Now, Mr. Smith, control yourself. Oh, think of your family, Dean. Think what a scandal—" But they burst out with maledictions, imprecations, and all the hard names they could dig out of the rich accumulation of their educated memories, and in the midst of it the man shouted, "When gentlemen come to this house, I treat them as gentlemen. When people come to this house with ordinary appetites of gentlemen, I charge them $1.30 for what I furnished you. But when a man brings a hell-fired famine here that gorges a barrel of pork and 4 barrels of beans at 2 sittings," Sage broke in a voice that was eloquent with remorse and self-reproach, "I never thought of that, and I ask your pardon. I am ashamed of myself and of my friend. Here's your $13, and my apologies along with it." Dictated March 12, 1906. I have always taken a great interest in other people's duels. One always feels an abiding interest in any heroic thing which has entered into his own experience. In 1878, 14 years after my unmaterialized duel, Messieurs Fortu and Gambetta fought a duel which made heroes of both of them in France, but made them rather ridiculous throughout the rest of the world. I was living in Munich that fall and winter, and I was so interested in that funny tragedy that I wrote a long account of it, and it is one of my books somewhere, an account which had some inaccuracies in it, but as an exhibition of the spirit of that duel I think it was correct and trustworthy. And when I was living in Vienna, 34 years after my ineffectual duel, my interest in that kind of incident was still strong, and I find here among my autobiographical manuscripts of that day a chapter which I began concerning it, but did not finish. I wanted to finish it, but held it open in the hope that the Italian ambassador, Mr. Nigra, would find time to furnish me the full history of Signor Cavalotti's adventures in that line. But he was a busy man, there was always an interruption before he could get well started, so my hope was never fulfilled. The following is the unfinished chapter. As concerns dueling, this pastime is as common in Austria today as it is in France, but with this difference, that here in the Austrian states the duel is dangerous, while in France it is not. Here it is tragedy, in France it is comedy. Here it is a solemnity, there it is monkey shines. Here the duelist risks his life, there he does not even risk his shirt. Here he fights with pistol or sabre, in France with a hairpin, a blunt one. Here the desperately wounded man tries to walk to the hospital. There they paint the scratch so that they can find it again, lay the sufferer on a stretcher, and conduct him off the field with a band of music. At the end of a French duel the pair hug and kiss and cry and praise each other's valor. Then the surgeons make an examination and pick out the scratched one, and the other one helps him onto the litter and pays his fare, and in return the scratched one treats to champagne and oysters in the evening, and then the incident is closed, as the French say. It is all polite and gracious and pretty and impressive. At the end of an Austrian duel, the antagonist that is alive gravely offers his hand to the other man, utters some phrases of courteous regret, then bids him good-bye and goes his way, and that incident also is closed. The French duelist is painstakingly protected from danger by the rules of the game. His antagonist's weapon cannot reach so far as his body. If he gets a scratch it will not be above his elbow. But in Austria the rules of the game do not provide against danger, they carefully provide for it, usually. Commonly the combat must be kept up until one of the men is disabled. A non-disabling slash or stab does not retire him. For a matter of 3 months I watched the Viennese journals, and whenever a duel was reported in their telegraphic columns, I scrap-booked it. By this record I find that dueling in Austria is not confined to journalists and old maids as in France, but is indulged in by military men, journalists, students, physicians, lawyers, members of the legislature, and even the cabinet, the bench, and the police. Dueling is forbidden by law, and so it seems odd to see the makers and administrators of the laws dancing on their work in this way. Some months ago Count Bodeni, at that time chief of the government, fought a pistol duel here in the capital city of the empire with Representative Wolfe, and both of those distinguished Christians came near getting turned out of the church, for the church as well as the state forbids dueling. In one case lately, in Hungary, the police interfered and stopped a duel after the first innings. This was a sabre duel between the chief of police and the city attorney. Unkind things were said about it by the newspapers. They said the police remembered their duty uncommonly well when their own officials were the parties concerned in duels, but I think the underlings showed good bread-and-butter judgment. If their superiors had carved each other well, the public would have asked, where were the police? And their places would have been endangered. But custom does not require them to be around where mere unofficial citizens are explaining a thing with sabres. There was another duel, a double duel, going on in the immediate neighborhood at the time, and in this case the police obeyed custom and did not disturb it. Their bread and butter was not at stake there. In this duel a physician fought a couple of surgeons, and wounded both, one of them lightly, the other seriously. An undertaker wanted to keep people from interfering, but that was quite natural again. Selecting at random from my record, I next find a duel at Tarnopol between military men. An officer of the 10th Dragoons charged an officer of the 9th Dragoons with an offense against the laws of the card table. There was a defect or a doubt somewhere in the matter, and this had to be examined and passed upon by a court of honor. So the case was sent up to Lemberg for this purpose. One would like to know what the defect was, but the newspaper does not say. A man here who has fought many duels and has a graveyard says that probably the matter in question was as to whether the accusation was true or not, that if the charge was a very grave one, cheating for instance, proof of its truth would rule the guilty officer out of the field of honor. The court would not allow a gentleman to fight with such a person. You see what a solemn thing it is. You see how particular they are. Any little careless act can lose you your privilege of getting yourself shot here." The court seems to have gone into the matter in a searching and careful fashion, for several months elapsed before it reached a decision. It then sanctioned a duel, and the accused killed his accuser. Next I find a duel between a prince and a major, first with pistols, no result satisfactory to either party, then with sabers, and the major badly hurt. Next, a saber duel between journalists, the one a strong man, the other feeble and in poor health. It was brief. The strong one drove his sword through the weak one, and death was immediate. Next, a duel between a lieutenant and a student of medicine. According to the newspaper report, these are the details. The student was in a restaurant one evening. Passing along, he halted at a table to speak with some friends. Near by sat a dozen military men. The student conceived that one of these was staring at him. He asked the officer to step outside and explain. This officer and another one gathered up their caps and sabers and went out with the student. Outside, this is the student's account, the student introduced himself to the offending officer and said, "You seem to stare at me." For answer, the officer struck at the student with his fist. The student parried the blow. Both officers drew their sabers and attacked the young fellow, and one of them gave him a wound on the left arm. Then they withdrew. This was Saturday night. The duel followed on Monday in the military riding school, the customary dueling ground all over Austria, apparently. The weapons were pistols. The dueling terms were somewhat beyond custom in the manner of severity, if I may gather that from the statement that the combat was fought unter sehr schweren Bedingungen, to wit, distance 15 steps, with 3 steps advance. There was one exchange of shots. The student was hit. He put his hand on his breast, his body began to bend slowly forward, then collapsed in death and sank to the ground. It is pathetic. There are other duels in my list, but I find in each and all of them one and the same ever-recurring defect. The principals are never present, but only their sham representatives. The real principals in any duel are not the duelists themselves, but their families. They do the mourning, the suffering. Theirs is the loss, and theirs the misery. They stake all that. The duelists stake nothing but his life, and that is a trivial thing compared with what his death must cost those whom he leaves behind him. Challenges should not mention the duelist. He has nothing much at stake, and the real vengeance cannot reach him. The challenge should summon the offender's old gray mother, and his young wife, and his little children, these, or any to whom he is a dear and worshipped possession, and should say, "You have done me no harm, but I am the meek slave of a custom which requires me to crush the happiness out of your hearts and condemn you to years of pain and grief, in order that I may wash clean with your tears a stain which has been put upon me by another person." The logic of it is admirable. A person has robbed me of a penny. I must beggar 10 innocent persons to make good my loss. Surely nobody's honor is worth all that. Since the duelist's family are the real principals in a duel, the state ought to compel them to be present at it. Custom also ought to be so amended as to require it, and without it no duel ought to be allowed to go on. If that student's unoffending mother had been present, and watching the officer through her tears as he raised his pistol, he would have fired in the air. We know that, for we know how we are all made. Laws ought to be based upon the ascertained facts of our nature. It would be a simple thing to make a dueling law which would stop dueling. As things are now, the mother is never invited. She submits to this, and without outward complaint, for she, too, is the vassal of custom, and custom requires her to conceal her pain when she learns the disastrous news that her son must go to the dueling field, and by the powerful force that is lodged in habit and custom she is enabled to obey this trying requirement, a requirement which exacts a miracle of her, and gets it. Last January a neighbor of ours who has a young son in the army was wakened by this youth at 3 o'clock one morning, and she sat up in bed and listened to his message. "I have come to tell you something, mother, which will distress you, but you must be good and brave and bear it. I have been affronted by a fellow officer, and we fight at 3 this afternoon. Lie down and sleep now, and think no more about it." She kissed him good night and lay down paralyzed with grief and fear and said nothing. But she did not sleep. She prayed and mourned till the first streak of dawn, then fled to the nearest church and implored the Virgin for help. And from that church she went to another and another and another, church after church, and still church after church, and so spent all the day until 3 o'clock on her knees in agony and tears, then dragged herself home and sat down comfortless and desolate, to count the minutes and wait, with an outward show of calm, for what had been ordained for her, happiness or endless misery. Presently she heard the clank of a sabre. She had not known before what music was in that sound, and her son put his head in and said, X was in the wrong, and he apologized. So that incident was closed, and for the rest of her life the mother will always find something pleasant about the clank of a sabre, no doubt. In one of my listed duels, however, let it go, there is nothing particularly striking about it except that the seconds interfered, and prematurely too, for neither man was dead. This was certainly irregular. Neither of the men liked it. It was a duel with cavalry sabres, between an editor and a lieutenant. The editor walked to the hospital. The lieutenant was carried. In this country an editor who can write well is valuable, but he is not likely to remain so unless he can handle a sabre with charm. The following very recent telegram shows that also in France duels are humanely stopped as soon as they approach the French danger point. Reuters telegram, Paris, March 5th. The duel between Colonels Henry and Picard took place this morning in the riding school of the École Militaire, the doors of which were strictly guarded in order to prevent intrusion. The combatants, who fought with swords, were in position at 10 o'clock. At the first re-engagement, Lieutenant Colonel Henry was slightly scratched in the forearm, and just at the same moment his own blade appeared to touch his adversary's neck. Senator Ranc, who was Colonel Picard's second, stopped the fight, but as it was found that his principal had not been touched, the combat continued. A very sharp encounter ensued, in which Colonel Henry was wounded in the elbow, and the duel terminated. After which the stretcher and the band. In lurid contrast with this delicate flirtation, we have this fatal duel of day before yesterday in Italy, where the earnest Austrian duel is in vogue. I knew Cavalotti slightly, and this gives me a sort of personal interest in his duel. I first saw him in Rome several years ago. He was sitting on a block of stone in the Forum, and was writing something in his notebook, a poem or a challenge or something like that, and the friend who pointed him out to me said, "That is Cavalotti. He has fought 30 duels. Do not disturb him." I did not disturb him. May 13th, 1907. It is a long time ago. Cavalotti, poet, orator, satirist, statesman, patriot, was a great man, and his death was deeply lamented by his countrymen. Many monuments to his memory testify to this. In his duels he killed several of his antagonists and disabled the rest. By nature he was a little irascible. Once, when the officials of the library of Bologna threw out his books, the gentle poet went up there and challenged the whole 15. His parliamentary duties were exacting, but he proposed to keep coming up and fighting duels between trains until all those officials had been retired from the activities of life. Although he always chose the sword to fight with, he had never had a lesson with that weapon. When game was called, he waited for nothing, but always plunged at his opponent and rained such a storm of wild and original thrusts and whacks upon him that the man was dead or crippled before he could bring his science to bear. But his latest antagonist discarded science and won. He held his sword straight forward like a lance when Cavalotti made his plunge, with the result that he impaled himself upon it. It entered his mouth and passed out the back of his neck. Death was instantaneous. Dictated December 20th, 1906. 6 months ago, when I was recalling early days in San Francisco, I broke off at a place where I was about to tell about Captain Osborne's odd adventure at the What Cheer, or perhaps it was at another cheap feeding place, the Miners' Restaurant. It was a place where one could get good food on the cheapest possible terms, and its popularity was great among the multitudes whose purses were light. It was a good place to go to observe mixed humanity. Captain Osborne and Bret Harte went there one day and took a meal, and in the course of it Osborne fished up an interesting reminiscence of a dozen years before, and told about it. It was to this effect. He was a midshipman in the Navy when the Californian gold craze burst upon the world and set it wild with excitement. His ship made the long journey round the Horn and was approaching her goal, the Golden Gate, when an accident happened. "It happened to me," said Osborne. "I fell overboard. There was a heavy sea running, but no one was much alarmed about me, because we had on board a newly patented life-saving device which was believed to be competent to rescue anything that could fall overboard, from a midshipman to an anchor. Ours was the only ship that had this device. We were very proud of it, and had been anxious to give its powers a practical test. This thing was lashed to the garboard strake of the main topgallant mizzen-yard amidships. Note: can this be correct? I think there must be some mistake. M.T. And there was nothing to do but cut the lashings and heave it over. It would do the rest. One day the cry of 'Man overboard!' brought all hands on deck. Instantly the lashings were cut and the machine flung joyously over. Damnation, it went to the bottom like an anvil. By the time that the ship was brought to and a boat manned, I was to become but a bobbing speck on the waves half a mile astern, and losing my strength very fast. But by good luck there was a common seaman on board who had practical ideas in his head, and hadn't waited to see what the patent machine was going to do, but had run aft and sprung over after me the moment the alarm was cried through the ship. I had a good deal of a start of him, and the seas made his progress slow and difficult, but he stuck to his work and fought his way to me, and just in the nick of time he put his saving arms about me when I was about to go down. He held me up until the boat reached us and rescued us. By that time I was unconscious, and I was still unconscious when we arrived at the ship. A dangerous fever followed, and I was delirious for 3 days. Then I came to myself and at once inquired for my benefactor, of course. He was gone. We were lying at anchor in the bay, and every man had deserted to the gold mines except the commissioned officers. I found out nothing about my benefactor but his name, Burton Sanders, a name which I have held in grateful memory ever since. Every time I have been on the coast, these 12 or 13 years, I have tried to get track of him, but have never succeeded. I wish I could find him and make him understand that his brave act has never been forgotten by me. Heart, I would rather see him and take him by the hand than any other man on the planet." At this stage, or a little later, there was an interruption. A waiter near by said to another waiter, pointing, "Take a look at that tramp that's coming in. Ain't that the one that bilked the house last week out of 10 cents? "I believe it is. Let him alone. Don't pay any attention to him. Wait till we can get a good look at him." The tramp approached timidly and hesitatingly, with the air of one unsure and apprehensive. The waiters watched him furtively. When he was passing behind Hart's chair, one of them said, "He's the one," and they pounced upon him and proposed to turn him over to the police as a bilk. He begged piteously. He confessed his guilt, but said he had been driven to his crime by necessity, that when he had eaten the plate of beans and slipped out without paying for it, it was because he was starving, and hadn't the 10 cents to pay for it with. But the waiters would listen to no explanations, no palliations. He must be placed in custody. He brushed his hand across his eyes and said meekly that he would submit, being friendless. Each waiter took him by an arm and faced him about to conduct him away. Then his melancholy eyes fell upon Captain Osborne, and a light of glad and eager recognition flashed from them. He said, "Weren't you a midshipman once, sir, in the old Lancaster?" "Yes," said Osborne. "Why?" "Didn't you fall overboard?" "Yes, I did. How do you come to know about this?" "Wasn't there a new patent machine aboard, and didn't they throw it over to save you?" "Why, yes," said Osborne, laughing gently, "but it didn't do it." "No, sir, it was a sailor that done it." "It certainly was. Look here, my man, you are getting distinctly interesting. Were you of our crew?" "Yes, sir, I was." "I reckon you may be right. You do certainly know a good deal about that incident. What is your name?" "Burton Sanders." The captain sprang up, excited, and said, "Give me your hand. Give me both your hands. I'd rather shake them than inherit a fortune." And then he cried to the waiters, "Let him go. Take your hands off. He is my guest, and can have anything and everything this house is able to furnish. I am responsible." There was a love feast then. Captain Osborne ordered it regardless of expense, and he and Hart sat there and listened while the man told stirring adventures of his life and fed himself up to his eyebrows. Then Osborne wanted to be benefactor in his turn, and pay back some of his debt. The man said it could all be paid with $10, that it had been so long since he had owned that amount of money that it would seem a fortune to him, and he should be grateful beyond words if the captain could spare him that amount. The captain spared him 10 broad $20 gold pieces, and made him take them, in spite of his modest protestations, and gave him his address and said he must never fail to give him notice when he needed grateful service. Several months later Hart stumbled upon the man in the street. He was most comfortably drunk, and pleasant and chatty. Hart remarked upon the splendidly and movingly dramatic incident of the restaurant, and said, "How curious and fortunate and happy and interesting it was that you two should come together, after that long separation, and at exactly the right moment to save you from disaster and turn your defeat by the waiters into a victory. A preacher could make a great sermon out of that, for it does look as if the hand of Providence was in it." The hero's face assumed a sweetly genial expression, and he said, "Well now, it wasn't Providence this time. I was running the arrangements myself." "How do you mean?" "Oh, I hadn't ever seen the gentleman before. I was at the next table, with my back to you the whole time he was telling about it. I saw my chance, and slipped out and fetched the 2 waiters with me, and offered to give them a commission out of what I could get out of the captain if they would do a quarrel act with me and give me an opening. So then, after a minute or two, I straggled back, and you know the rest of it as well as I do." Mark Twain. To be continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, contact LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, October 1907, chapters from my autobiography, Chapter 23, by Mark Twain. Dictated March 9, 1906. I am talking of a time 60 years ago and upwards. I remember the names of some of those schoolmates, and by fitful glimpses even their faces rise dimly before me for a moment, only just long enough to be recognized. Then they vanish. I catch glimpses of George Robards, the Latin pupil, slender, pale, studious, bending over his book and absorbed in it, his long, straight black hair hanging down below his jaws like a pair of curtains on the side of his face. I can see him give his head a toss and flirt one of the curtains back around his head to get it out of his way, apparently, really to show off. In that day it was a great thing among the boys to have hair of so flexible a sort that it could be flung back in that way, with a flirt of the head. George Robards was the envy of us all, for there was no hair among us that was so competent for this exhibition as his, except perhaps the yellow locks of Will Bowen and John Robards. My hair was a dense ruck of short curls, and so was my brother Henry's. We tried all kinds of devices to get these crooks straightened out, so that they would flirt, but we never succeeded. Sometimes by soaking our heads and then combing and brushing our hair down tight and flat to our skulls, we could get it straight, temporarily, and this gave us a comforting moment of joy. But the first time we gave it a flirt, it all shriveled into curls again, and our happiness was gone. John Robards was the little brother of George. He was a wee chap with silky golden curtains to his face, which dangled to his shoulders and below, and could be flung back ravishingly. When he was 12 years old he crossed the plains with his father amidst the rush of the gold-seekers of '49, and I remember the departure of the cavalcade when it spurred westward. We were all there to see and to envy, and I can still see that proud little chap sailing by on a great horse with his long locks streaming out behind. We were all on hand to gaze and envy when he returned, 2 years later, in unimaginable glory, for he had traveled. None of us had ever been 40 miles from home, but he had crossed the continent. He had been in the gold mines, that fairyland of our imagination, and he had done a still more wonderful thing. He had been in ships on the actual ocean, in ships on 3 actual oceans. for he had sailed down the Pacific and around the Horn among icebergs and through snowstorms and wild wintry gales, and had sailed on and turned the corner and flown northward in the trades, and up through the blistering equatorial waters, and there, in his brown face, were the proofs of what he had been through. We would have sold our souls to Satan for the privilege of trading places with him. I saw him when I was out on that Missouri trip 4 years ago. He was old then, though not quite so old as I, and the burden of life was upon him. He said his granddaughter, 12 years old, had read my books and would like to see me. It was a pathetic time, for she was a prisoner in her room and marked for death, and John knew that she was passing swiftly away. 12 years old, just her grandfather's age when he rode away on that great journey with his yellow hair flapping behind him. In her I seemed to see that boy again. It was as if he had come back out of that remote past and was present before me in his golden youth. Her malady was heart disease, and her brief life came to a close a few days later. Another of those schoolboys was John Garth. He became a prosperous banker and a prominent and valued citizen, and a few years ago he died, rich and honored. He died. It is what I have to say about so many of those boys and girls. The widow still lives, and there are grandchildren. In her Pantalette days and my barefoot days she was a schoolmate of mine. I saw John's tomb when I made that Missouri visit. Her father, Mr. Kirkeval, had an apprentice in the early days when I was 9 years old, and he had also a slave woman who had many merits. But I can't feel very kindly or forgivingly towards either that good apprentice boy or that good slave woman, for they saved my life. One day when I was playing on a loose log which I supposed was attached to a raft, but it wasn't, it tilted me into Bear Creek. And when I had been under water twice and was coming up to make the third and fatal descent, my fingers appeared above the water, and that slave woman seized them and pulled me out. Within a week I was in again, and that apprentice had to come along just at the wrong time, and he plunged in and dived, pawed around on the bottom, and found me, and dragged me out and emptied the water out of me, and I was saved again. I was drowned 7 times after that before I learned to swim, once in Bear Creek, and 6 times in the Mississippi. I do not now know who the people were who interfered with the intentions of a Providence wiser than themselves, but I hold a grudge against them yet. When I told the tale of these remarkable happenings to Reverend Dr. Burton of Hartford, he said he did not believe it. He slipped on the ice the very next year and sprained his ankle. Will Bowen was another schoolmate, and so was his brother Sam, who was his junior by a couple of years. Before the Civil War broke out, both became St. Louis and New Orleans pilots. Both are dead long ago. Dictated March 16, 1906. We will return to those school children of 60 years ago. I recall Mary Miller. She was not my first sweetheart, but I think she was the first one that furnished me a broken heart. I fell in love with her when she was 18 and I was 9, but she scorned me, and I recognized that this was a cold world. I had not noticed that temperature before. I believe I was as miserable as even a grown man could be. But I think that this sorrow did not remain with me long. As I remember it, I soon transferred my worship to Artemisia Briggs, who was a year older than Mary Miller. When I revealed my passion to her, she did not scoff at it. She did not make fun of it. She was very kind and gentle about it. But she was also firm, and said she did not want to be pestered by children. And there was Mary Lacey. She was a schoolmate, but she also was out of my class because of her advanced age. She was pretty wild and determined and independent. But she married and at once settled down and became in all ways a model matron and as highly respected as any matron in the town. 4 years ago she was still living and had been married 50 years. Jimmy McDaniel was another schoolmate. His age and mine about tallied. His father kept the candy shop, and he was the most envied little chap in the town, after Tom Blankenship, Huck Finn. For although we never saw him eating candy, we supposed that it was nevertheless his ordinary diet. He pretended that he never ate it, and didn't care for it because there was nothing forbidden about it. There was plenty of it, and he could have as much of it as he wanted. He was the first human being to whom I ever told a humorous story, so far as I can remember. This was about Jim Wolfe and the cats, and I gave him that tale the morning after that memorable episode. I thought he would laugh his teeth out. I had never been so proud and happy before, and have seldom been so proud and happy since. I saw him 4 years ago when I was out there. He wore a beard, gray and venerable, that came halfway down to his knees, and yet it was not difficult for me to recognize him. He had been married 54 years. He had many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and also even posterity, they all said, thousands. Yet the boy to whom I had told the cat story when we were callow juveniles was still present in that cheerful little old man. Artemisia Briggs got married not long after refusing me. She married Richmond, the stonemason, who was my Methodist Sunday school teacher in the earliest days, and he had one distinction which I envied him. At some time or other he had hit his thumb with his hammer, and the result was a thumbnail which remained permanently twisted and distorted and curved and pointed like a parrot's beak. I should not consider it an ornament now, I suppose, but it had a fascination for me then, and a vast value, because it was the only one in the town. He was a very kindly and considerate Sunday school teacher, and patient and compassionate, so he was the favorite teacher with us little chaps. In that school they had slender oblong pasteboard blue tickets, each with a verse from the Testament printed on it, and you could get a blue ticket by reciting 2 verses. By reciting 5 verses you could get 3 blue tickets, and you could trade these at the bookcase and borrow a book for a week. I was under Mr. Richmond's spiritual care every now and then for 2 or 3 years, and he was never hard upon me. I always recited the same 5 verses every Sunday. He was always satisfied with the performance. He never seemed to notice that these were the same 5 foolish virgins that he had been hearing about every Sunday for months. I always got my tickets and exchanged them for a book. They were pretty dreary books, for there was not a bad boy in the entire bookcase. They were all good boys and good girls, and drearily uninteresting, but they were better society than none, and I was glad to have their company and disapprove of it. 20 years ago Mr. Richmond had become possessed of Tom Sawyer's Cave in the hills 3 miles from town, and had made a tourist resort of it. In 1849, when the gold seekers were streaming through our little town of Hannibal, many of our grown men got the gold fever, and I think that all the boys had it. On the Saturday holidays in summertime we used to borrow skiffs whose owners were not present, and go down the river 3 miles to the Cave Hollow, Missourian for valley, and there we staked out claims and pretended to dig gold, panning out $50 a day at first, 2 or 3 times as much later, and by whole fortunes, as our imaginations became inured to the work. Stupid and unprophetic lads, we were doing this in play and never suspecting. Why, that Cave Hollow and all the adjacent hills were made of gold, but we did not know it. We took it for dirt. We left its rich secret in its own peaceful possession, and grew up in poverty, and went wandering about the world struggling for bread, and this because we had not the gift of prophecy. That region was all dirt and rocks to us, yet all it needed was to be ground up and scientifically handled, and it was gold. That is to say, the whole region was a cement mine, and they make the finest kind of Portland cement there now, 5,000 barrels a day, with a plant that cost $2 million. For a little while Ruel Gridley attended that school of ours. He was an elderly pupil. He was perhaps 22 or 23 years old. Then came the Mexican War, and he volunteered. A company of infantry was raised in our town, and Mr. Hickman, a tall, straight, handsome athlete of 25, was made captain of it, and had a sword by his side and a broad yellow stripe down the leg of his gray pants. And when that company marched back and forth through the streets in its smart uniform, which it did several times a day for drill, its evolutions were attended by all the boys whenever the school hours permitted. I can see that marching company yet, and I can almost feel again the consuming desire that I had to join it. But they had no use for boys of 12 and 13, and before I had a chance in another war the desire to kill people to whom I had not been introduced had passed away. I saw the splendid Hickman in his old age. He seemed about the oldest man I had ever seen, an amazing and melancholy contrast with the showy young captain I had seen preparing his warriors for carnage so many, many years before. Hickman is dead. It is the old story. As Susie said, what is it all for? Ruel Gridley went away to the wars, and we heard of him no more for 15 or 16 years. Then one day in Carson City, while I was having a difficulty with an editor on the sidewalk, an editor better built for war than I was, I heard a voice say, "Give him the best you've got, Sam. I'm at your back." It was Rule Gridley. He said he had not recognized me by my face, but by my drawling style of speech. He went down to see the Reese River mines about that time, and presently he lost an election bet in his mining camp, and by the terms of it he was obliged to buy a 50-pound sack of self-rising flour and carry it through the town, preceded by music, and deliver it to the winner of the bet. Of course the whole camp was present, and full of fluid and enthusiasm. The winner of the bet put up the sack at auction for the benefit of the United States Sanitary Fund, and sold it. The excitement grew and grew. The sack was sold over and over again for the benefit of the fund. The news of it came to Virginia City by telegraph. It produced great enthusiasm, and Rule Gridley was begged by telegraph to bring the sack and have an auction in Virginia City. He brought it. An open barouche was provided, also a brass band. The sack was sold over and over again at Gold Hill, then was brought up to Virginia City toward night, and sold again, and still again, netting $20,000 or $30,000 for the sanitary fund. Gridley carried it across California and sold it at various towns. He sold it for large sums in Sacramento and in San Francisco. He brought it east, sold it in New York and in various other cities, then carried it out to a great fair at St. Louis, and went on selling it. And finally he made it up into small cakes and sold those at $1 apiece. First and last, the sack of flour, which had originally cost $10 perhaps, netted more than $200,000 for the sanitary fund. Rule Gridley has been dead these many, many years. It is the old story. In that school were the first Jews I had ever seen. It took me a good while to get over the awe of it. To my fancy they were clothed invisibly in the damp and cobwebby mold of antiquity. They carried me back to Egypt, and in imagination I moved among the pharaohs and all the shadowy celebrities of that remote age. The name of the boys was Levin. We had a collective name for them, which was the only really large and handsome witticism that was ever born in that congressional district. We called them 22, and even when the joke was old and had been worn threadbare, we always followed it with the explanation to make sure that it would be understood. Twice 11, 22. There were other boys whose names remain with me. Irving Ayres, but no matter, he is dead. Then there was George Butler, whom I remember as a child of 7 wearing a blue leather belt with a brass buckle, and hated and envied by all the boys on account of it. He was a nephew of General Ben Butler, and fought gallantly at Ball's Bluff and in several other actions of the Civil War. He is dead long and long ago. Will Bowen, dead long ago. Ed Stevens, dead long ago. And John Briggs were special mates of mine. John is still living. In 1845, when I was 10 years old, there was an epidemic of measles in the town, and it made a most alarming slaughter among the little people. There was a funeral almost daily, and the mothers of the town were nearly demented with fright. My mother was greatly troubled. She worried over Pamela and Henry and me, and took constant and extraordinary pains to keep us from coming into contact with the contagion. But upon reflection I believed that her judgment was at fault. It seemed to me that I could improve upon it if left to my own devices. I cannot remember now whether I was frightened about the measles or not, but I clearly remember that I grew very tired of the suspense I suffered on account of being continually under the threat of death. I remember that I got so weary of it, and so anxious to have the matter settled one way or the other, and promptly, that this anxiety spoiled my days and my nights. I had no pleasure in them. I made up my mind to end this suspense and be done with it. Will Bowen was dangerously ill with the measles, and I thought I would go down there and catch them. I entered the house by the front way, and slipped along through rooms and halls, keeping sharp watch against discovery, and at last I reached Will's bedchamber in the rear of the house on the second floor, and got into it uncaptured. But that was as far as my victory reached. His mother caught me there a moment later and snatched me out of the house and gave me a most competent scolding and drove me away. She was so scared that she could hardly get her words out, and her face was white. I saw that I must manage better next time, and I did. I hung about the lane at the rear of the house and watched through cracks in the fence until I was convinced that the conditions were favorable. Then I slipped through the backyard and up the back way and got into the room and into the bed with Will Bowen without being observed. I don't know how long I was in the bed. I only remember that Will Bowen, as society, had no value for me, for he was too sick to even notice that I was there. When I heard his mother coming, I covered up my head, but that device was a failure. It was dead summertime. The cover was nothing more than a limp blanket or sheet, and anybody could see that there were two of us under it. It didn't remain too very long. Mrs. Bowen snatched me out of the bed and conducted me home herself with a grip on my collar which she never loosened until she delivered me into my mother's hands along with her opinion of that kind of a boy. It was a good case of measles that resulted. It brought me within a shade of death's door. It brought me to where I no longer took any interest in anything, but, on the contrary, felt a total absence of interest, which was most placid and enchanting. I have never enjoyed anything in my life any more than I enjoyed dying that time. I was, in effect, dying. The word had been passed, and the family notified to assemble around the bed and see me off. I knew them all. There was no doubtfulness in my vision. They were all crying, but that did not affect me. I took but the vaguest interest in it, and that merely because I was the center of all this emotional attention and was gratified by it and vain of it. When Dr. Cunningham had made up his mind that nothing more could be done for me, he put bags of hot ashes all over me. He put them on my breast, on my wrists, on my ankles, and so, very much to his astonishment and doubtless to my regret, he dragged me back into this world and set me going again. Dictated July 26, 1907. In an article entitled England's Ovation to Mark Twain, Sidney Brooks, but never mind that now. I was in Oxford by 7 o'clock that evening, June 25, 1907, and trying on the scarlet gown which the tailor had been constructing, and found it right and surpassingly becoming. At 10:30 the next morning we assembled at All Souls College, and marched thence, gowned, mortar-boarded, and in double file, down a long street to the Sheldonian Theater, between solid walls of the populace, very much hurrahed and limitlessly kodaked. We made a procession of considerable length and distinction and picturesqueness, with the Chancellor, Lord Curzon, late Viceroy of India, in his rich robe of black and gold, in the lead, followed by a pair of trim little boy train-bearers, and the train-bearers followed by the young Prince Arthur of Connaught, who was to be made a D.C.L. The detachment of D.C.L.'s were followed by the Doctors of Science, and these by the Doctors of Literature, and these in turn by the Doctors of Music. Sidney Colvin marched in front of me. I was coupled with Sidney Lee, and Kipling followed us. General Booth of the Salvation Army was in the squadron of D.C.L.'s. Our journey ended, we were halted in a fine old hall whence we could see, through a corridor of some length, the massed audience in the theater. Here for a little time we moved about and chatted and made acquaintanceships. Then the D.C.L.'s were summoned, and they marched through that corridor, and the shouting began in the theater. It would be some time before the Doctors of Literature and of Science would be called for, because each of those D.C.L.'s had to have a couple of Latin speeches made over him before his promotion would be complete, one by the Regius Professor of Civil Law, and the other by the Chancellor. After a while I asked Sir William Ramsay if a person might smoke here and not get shot, and he said yes, but that whoever did it and got caught would be fined a guinea, and perhaps hanged later. He said he knew of a place where we could accomplish at least as much as half of a smoke before any informers would be likely to chance upon us, and he was ready to show the way to any who might be willing to risk the guinea and the hanging. By request he led the way, and Kipling, Sir Norman Lockyer, and I followed. We crossed an unpopulated quadrangle and stood under one of its exits, an archway of massive masonry, and there we lit up and began to take comfort. The photographers soon arrived, but they were courteous and friendly and gave us no trouble, and we gave them none. They grouped us in all sorts of ways and photographed us at their diligent leisure while we smoked and talked. We were there more than an hour. Then we returned to headquarters, happy, content, and greatly refreshed. Presently we filed into the theater, under a very satisfactory hurrah, and waited in a crimson column, dividing the crowded pit through the middle, until each of us in his turn should be called to stand before the Chancellor and hear our merits set forth in sonorous Latin. Meantime, Kipling and I wrote autographs until some good kind soul interfered in our behalf and procured for us a rest. I will now save what is left of my modesty by quoting a paragraph from Sidney Brooks' Ovation. Let those stars take the place of it for the present. Sidney Brooks has done it well. It makes me proud to read it, as proud as I was in that old day 62 years ago when I lay dying, the center of attraction, with one eye piously closed upon the fleeting vanities of this life, an excellent effect, and the other open a crack to observe the tears, the sorrow, the admiration, all for me, all for me. Ah, that was the proudest moment of my long life, until Oxford. Most Americans have been to Oxford, and will remember what a dream of the Middle Ages it is, with its crooked lanes, its gray and stately piles of ancient architecture, and its meditation-breeding air of repose and dignity and unkinship with the noise and fret and hurry and bustle of these modern days. As a dream of the Middle Ages, Oxford was not perfect until Pageant Day arrived and furnished certain details which had been for generations lacking. These details began to appear at mid-afternoon on the 27th. At that time, singles, couples, groups, and squadrons of the 3,500 costume characters who were to take part in the pageant began to ooze and drip and stream through house doors all over the old town and wend towards the meadows outside the walls. Soon the lanes were thronged with costumes which Oxford had from time to time seen and been familiar with in bygone centuries, fashions of dress which marked off centuries as by dates, and milestoned them back and back and back until history faded into legend and tradition when Arthur was a fact and the Round Table a reality. In this rich commingling of quaint and strange and brilliantly colored fashions in dress, the dress changes of Oxford for 12 centuries stood livid and realized to the eye. Oxford, as a dream of the Middle Ages, was complete now, as it had never, in our day, before been complete. At last there was no discord. The moldering old buildings and the picturesque throngs drifting past them were in harmony. Soon, astonishingly soon, the only persons that seemed out of place and grotesquely and offensively and criminally out of place were such persons as came intruding along clothed in the ugly and odious fashions of the 20th century. They were a bitterness to the feelings, an insult to the eye. The make-ups of illustrious historic personages seemed perfect, both as to portraiture and costume. One had no trouble in recognizing them. Also, I was apparently quite easily recognizable myself. The first corner I turned brought me suddenly face to face with Henry VIII, a person whom I had been implacably disliking for 60 years. But when he put out his hand with royal courtliness and grace and said, "Welcome, well-beloved stranger, to my century and to the hospitalities of my realm," my old prejudices vanished away and I forgave him. I think now that Henry VIII has been over-abused, and that most of us, if we had been situated as he was, domestically, would not have been able to get along with as limited a graveyard as he forced himself to put up with. I feel now that he was one of the nicest men in history. Personal contact with a king is more effective in removing baleful prejudices than is any amount of argument drawn from tales and histories. If I had a child, I would name it Henry VIII, regardless of sex. Do you remember Charles the First, and his broad slouch with a plume in it, and his slender tall figure, and his body clothed in velvet doublet with lace sleeves, and his legs in leather with long rapier at his side and his spurs on his heels? I encountered him at the next corner, and knew him in a moment, knew him as perfectly and as vividly as I should know the Grand Chain in the Mississippi if I should see it from the pilot-house after all these years. He bent his body and gave his hat a sweep that fetched its plume within an inch of the ground, and gave me a welcome that went to my heart. This king has been much maligned. I shall understand him better hereafter, and shall regret him more than I have been in the habit of doing these 50 or 60 years. He did some things in his time which might better have been left undone, and which cast a shadow upon his name. We all know that, we all concede it, but our error has been in regarding them as crimes, and in calling them by that name, whereas I perceive now that they were only indiscretions. At every few steps I met persons of deathless name whom I had never encountered before outside of pictures and statuary and history, and these were most thrilling and charming encounters. I had handshakes with Henry II, who had not been seen in the Oxford streets for nearly 800 years, and with the fair Rosamund, whom I now believe to have been chaste and blameless, although I had thought differently about it before, and with Shakespeare, one of the pleasantest foreigners I have ever gotten acquainted with, and with Roger Bacon, and with Queen Elizabeth, who talked 5 minutes and never swore once, a fact which gave me a new and good opinion of her and moved me to forgive her for beheading the Scottish Mary, if she really did it, which I now doubt, and with the quaintly and anciently clad young King Harold Harefoot, of near 900 years ago, who came flying by on a bicycle and smoking a pipe, but at once checked up and got off to shake with me, and also I met a bishop who had lost his way because this was the first time he had been inside the walls of Oxford for as much as 1200 years, or thereabouts. By this time I had grown so used to the obliterated ages and their best-known people that if I had met Adam I should not have been either surprised or embarrassed, and if he had come in a racing automobile and a cloud of dust with nothing on but his fig-leaf, it would have seemed to me all right and harmonious. Mark Twain, to be continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, Chapters from My Autobiography, Chapter 24, by Mark Twain. From Susie's Biography of Me, 1885-86. Mama and Papa have returned from Onteora, and they have had a delightful visit. Mr. Frank Stockton was down in Virginia, and could not reach Onteora in time, so they did not see him, and Mrs. Mary Mapes Dodge was ill and couldn't go to Onteora, but Mrs. General Custer was there, and Mama said that she was a very attractive, sweet-appearing woman. Dictated October 9th, 1906. Onteora was situated high up in the Catskill Mountains in the center of a far-reaching solitude. I do not mean that the region was wholly uninhabited. There were farmhouses here and there at generous distances apart. Their occupants were descendants of ancestors who had built the houses in Rip Van Winkle's time or earlier, and those ancestors were not more primitive than were this posterity of theirs. The city people were as foreign and unfamiliar and strange to them as monkeys would have been, and they would have respected the monkeys as much as they respected these elegant summer resorters. The resorters were a puzzle to them. Their ways were so strange and their interests so trivial. They drove the resorters over the mountain roads and listened in shamed surprise at their bursts of enthusiasm over the scenery. The farmers had had that scenery on exhibition from their mountain roosts all their lives, and had never noticed anything remarkable about it. By way of an incident, a pair of these primitives were overheard chatting about the resorters one day, and in the course of their talk this remark was dropped. "I was a-driving a passel of them around 'bout yesterday evening, quiet ones, you know, still and solemn, and all to once they busted out to make your hair lift, and I judged hell was to pay. Now what do you reckon it was? Warn't anything but just one of them common damned yaller sunsets." In those days. Tuesday, October 16th, 1906. Warner is gone. Stockton is gone. I attended both funerals. Warner was a near neighbor from the autumn of '71 until his death 19 years afterward. It is not the privilege of the most of us to have many intimate friends. A dozen is our aggregate. But I think he could count his by the score. It is seldom that a man is so beloved by both sexes and all ages as Warner was. There was a charm about his spirit and his ways and his words that won all that came within the sphere of its influence. Our children adopted him while they were little creatures, and thenceforth to the end he was Cousin Charlie to them. He was Uncle Charlie to the children of more than one other friend. Mrs. Clemens was very fond of him, and he always called her by her first name, shortened. Warner died, as she died, and as I would die, without premonition, without a moment's warning. Uncle Remus still lives, and must be over 1,000 years old. Indeed, I know that this must be so, because I have seen a new photograph of him in the public prints within the last month or so, and in that picture his aspects are distinctly and strikingly geological, and one can see he is thinking about the mastodons and the plesiosaurians that he used to play with when he was young. It is just a quarter of a century since I have seen Uncle Remus. He visited us in our home in Hartford, and was reverently devoured by the big eyes of Susie and Clara, for I made a deep and awful impression upon the little creatures, who knew his book by heart through my nightly declamations of its tales to them. By revealing to them privately that he was the real Uncle Remus, whitewashed so that he could come into people's houses the front way. He was the bashfulest grown person I have ever met. When there were people about he stayed silent and seemed to suffer until they were gone. But he was lovely, nevertheless, for the sweetness and benignity of the immortal Remus looked out from his eyes, and the graces and sincerities of his character shone in his face. It may be that Jim Wolfe was as bashful as Harris. It hardly seems possible. Yet as I look back 56 years and consider Jim Wolfe, I am almost persuaded that he was. He was our long, slim apprentice in my brother's printing office in Hannibal. He was 17, and yet he was as much as 4 times as bashful as I was, though I was only 14. He boarded and slept in the house, but he was always tongue-tied in the presence of my sister, and when even my gentle mother spoke to him he could not answer save in frightened monosyllables. He would not enter a room where a girl was. Nothing could persuade him to do such a thing. Once, when he was in our small parlor alone, 2 majestic old maids entered and seated themselves in such a way that Jim could not escape without passing by them. He would as soon have thought of passing by one of Harris's plesiosaurians 90 feet long. I came in presently, was charmed with the situation, and sat down in a corner to watch Jim suffer and enjoy it. My mother followed a minute later and sat down with the visitors and began to talk. Jim sat upright in his chair, and during a quarter of an hour he did not change his position by a shade. Neither General Grant nor a bronze image could have maintained that immovable pose more successfully. I mean as to body and limbs. With the face there was a difference. By fleeting revealments of the face I saw that something was happening, something out of the common. There would be a sudden twitch of the muscles of the face, an instant distortion, which in the next instant had passed and left no trace. These twitches gradually grew in frequency, but no muscle outside of the face lost any of its rigidity or betrayed any interest in what was happening to Jim. I mean, if something was happening to him, and I knew perfectly well that that was the case. At last a pair of tears began to swim slowly down his cheeks amongst the twitchings, but Jim sat still and let them run. Then I saw his right hand steal along his thigh until halfway to his knee, then take a vigorous grip upon the cloth. That was a wasp that he was grabbing. A colony of them were climbing up his legs and prospecting around, and every time he winced they stabbed him to the hilt. So for a quarter of an hour one group of excursionists after another climbed up Jim's legs and resented even the slightest wince or squirm that he indulged himself with in his misery. When the entertainment had become nearly unbearable he conceived the idea of gripping them between his fingers and putting them out of commission. He succeeded with many of them, but at great cost, for as he couldn't see the wasp, he was as likely to take hold of the wrong end of him as he was the right. Then the dying wasp gave him a punch to remember the incident by. If those ladies had stayed all day, and if all the wasps in Missouri had come and climbed up Jim's legs, nobody there would ever have known it but Jim and the wasps and me. There he would have sat until the ladies left. When they finally went away, we went upstairs, and he took his clothes off, and his legs were a picture to look at. They looked as if they were mailed over with shirt-buttons, each with a single red hole in the center. The pain was intolerable. No, would have been intolerable, but the pain of the presence of those ladies had been so much harder to bear that the pain of the wasp's stings was quite pleasant and enjoyable by comparison. Jim never could enjoy wasps. I remember once, from Susie's Biography of Me, 1885, 6. Mama has given me a very pleasant little newspaper scrap about Papa to copy. I will put it in here. Thursday, October 11th, 1906. It was a rather strong compliment. I think I will leave it out. It was from James Redpath. The chief ingredients of Redpath's make-up were honesty, sincerity, kindliness, and pluck. He wasn't afraid. He was one of Osawatomie Brown's right-hand men in the bleeding Kansas days. He was all through that struggle. He carried his life in his hands, and from one day to another it wasn't worth the price of a night's lodging. He had a small body of daring men under him, and they were constantly being hunted by the jayhawkers, who were pro-slavery Missourians, guerrillas, modern freelances. Friday, October 12, 1906. I can't think of the name of that daredevil guerrilla who led the jayhawkers and chased Redpath up and down the country, and in turn was chased by Redpath. By grace of the chances of war, the two men never met in the field, though they several times came within an ace of it. 10 or 12 years later, Redpath was earning his living in Boston as chief of the lecture business in the United States. 15 or 16 years after his canvas adventures, I became a public lecturer, and he was my agent. Along there somewhere was a press dinner one November night at the Tremont Hotel in Boston, and I attended it. I sat near the head of the table, with Redpath between me and the chairman. A stranger sat on my other side. I tried several times to talk with the stranger, but he seemed to be out of words, and I presently ceased from troubling him. He was manifestly a very shy man, and, moreover, he might have been losing sleep the night before. The first man called up was Redpath. At the mention of the name the stranger started and showed interest. He fixed a fascinated eye on Redpath and lost not a word of his speech. Redpath told some stirring incidents of his career in Kansas, and said, among other things, "3 times I came near capturing the gallant jayhawker chief, and once he actually captured me, but didn't know me, and let me go, because he said he was hot on Redpath's trail and couldn't afford to waste time and rope on inconsequential small fry." My stranger was called up next, and when Redpath heard his name he in turn showed a startled interest. The stranger said, bending a caressing glance upon Redpath and speaking gently, I may even say sweetly, "You realize that I was that jayhawker, chief. I am glad to know you now, and take you to my heart and call you friend." Then he added in a voice that was pathetic with regret, "But if I had only known you then, what tumultuous happiness I should have had in your society while it lasted." The last quarter of a century of my life has been pretty constantly and faithfully devoted to the study of the human race. That is to say, the study of myself, for in my individual person I am the entire human race compacted together. I have found that there is no ingredient of the race which I do not possess in either a small way or a large way. When it is small, as compared with the same ingredient in somebody else, there is still enough of it for all the purposes of examination. In my contacts with the species, I find no one who possesses a quality which I do not possess. The shades of difference between other people and me serve to make variety and prevent monotony, but that is all. Broadly speaking, we are all alike, and so by studying myself carefully, and comparing myself with other people, and noting the divergences, I have been enabled to acquire a knowledge of the human race which I perceive is more accurate and more comprehensive than that which has been acquired and revealed by any other member of our species. As a result, my private and concealed opinion of myself is not of a complimentary sort. It follows that my estimate of the human race is the duplicate of my estimate of myself. I am not proposing to discuss all of the peculiarities of the human race at this time. I only wish to touch lightly upon 1 or 2 of them. To begin with, I wonder why a man should prefer a good billiard table to a poor one, and why he should prefer straight cues to crooked ones, and why he should prefer round balls to chipped ones, and why he should prefer a level table to one that slants, and why he should prefer responsive cushions to the dull and unresponsive ones. I wonder at these things, because when we examine the matter we find that the essentials involved in billiards are as completely and exhaustively furnished by a bad billiard outfit as they are by the best one. One of the essentials is amusement. Very well, if there is any more amusement to be gotten out of the one outfit than out of the other, the facts are in favor of the bad outfit. The bad outfit will always furnish 30% more fun for the players and for the spectators than will the good outfit. Another essential of the game is that the outfit shall give the players full opportunity to exercise their best skill and display it in a way to compel the admiration of the spectators. Very well, the bad outfit is nothing behind the good one in this regard. It is a difficult matter to estimate correctly the eccentricities of chipped balls and a slanting table, and make the right allowance for them and secure a count. The finest kind of skill is required to accomplish the satisfactory result. Another essential of the game is that it shall add to the interest of the game by furnishing opportunities to bet. Very well, in this regard no good outfit can claim any advantage over a bad one. I know by experience that a bad outfit is as valuable as the best one, that an outfit that couldn't be sold at auction for $7 is just as valuable for all the essentials of the game as an outfit that is worth 1,000. I acquired some of this learning in Jackass Gulch, California, more than 40 years ago. Jackass Gulch had once been a rich and thriving surface mining camp. By and by its gold deposits were exhausted. Then the people began to go away, and the town began to decay, and rapidly. In my time it had disappeared. Where the bank, and the city hall, and the church, and the gambling dens, and the newspaper office, and the streets of brick blocks had been, was nothing now but a wide and beautiful expanse of green grass, a peaceful and charming solitude. Half a dozen scattered dwellings were still inhabited, and there was still one saloon of a ruined and rickety character struggling for life, but doomed. In its bar was a billiard outfit that was the counterpart of the one in my father-in-law's garret. The balls were chipped, the cloth was darned and patched, the table's surface was undulating, and the cues were headless and had the curve of a parenthesis. But the forlorn remnant of marooned miners played games there, and those games were more entertaining to look at than a circus and a grand opera combined. Nothing but a quite extraordinary skill could score a carom on that table, a skill that required the nicest estimate of force, distance, and how much to allow for the various slants of the table and the other formidable peculiarities and idiosyncrasies furnished by the contradictions of the outfit. Last winter, here in New York, I saw Hopp and Schaefer and Sutton and the 3 or 4 other billiard champions of world-wide fame contend against each other, and certainly the art and science displayed were a wonder to see. Yet I saw nothing there in a way of science and art that was more wonderful than shots which I had seen Texas Tom make on the wavy surface of that poor old wreck in the perishing saloon at Jackass Gulch 40 years before. Once I saw Texas Tom make a string of 7 points on a single inning, all calculated shots, and not a fluke or a scratch among them. I often saw him make runs of 4, but when he made his great string of 7 the boys went wild with enthusiasm and admiration. The joy and the noise exceeded that which the great gathering at Madison Square produced when Sutton scored 500 points at the 18-inch game on a world-famous night last winter. With practice, that champion could score 19 or 20 on the Jackass Gulch table, but to start with, Texas Tom would show him miracles that would astonish him. Also, it might have another handsome result. It might persuade the great experts to discard their own trifling game and bring the Jackass Gulch outfit here and exhibit their skill in a game worth 100 of the discarded one, for profound and breathless interest and for displays of almost superhuman skill. In my experience, games played with a fiendish outfit furnish ecstasies of delight which games played with the other kind cannot match. 27 years ago my budding little family spent the summer at Bateman's Point near Newport, Rhode Island. It was a comfortable boarding place, well stocked with sweet mothers and little children, but the male sex was scarce. However, there was another young fellow besides myself, and he and I had good times. Higgins was his name, but that was not his fault. He was a very pleasant and companionable person. On the premises there was what had once been a bowling alley. It was a single alley, and it was estimated that it had been out of repair for 60 years, but not the balls. The balls were in good condition. There were 41 of them, and they ranged in size from a grapefruit up to a lignum vitae sphere that you could hardly lift. Higgins and I played on that alley day after day. At first one of us located himself at the bottom end to set up the pins in case anything should happen to them, but nothing happened. The surface of that alley consisted of a rolling stretch of elevations and depressions, and neither of us could, by any art known to us, persuade a ball to stay on the alley until it should accomplish something. Little balls and big, the same thing always happened. The ball left the alley before it was halfway home, and went thundering down alongside of it the rest of the way, and made the gamekeeper climb out and take care of himself. No matter, we persevered, and were rewarded. We examined the alley, noted and located a lot of its peculiarities, and little by little we learned how to deliver a ball in such a way that it would travel home and knock down a pin or two. By and by we succeeded in improving our game to a point where we were able to get all of the pins with 35 balls. So we made it a 35-ball game. If the player did not succeed with 35, he had lost the game. I suppose that all of the balls taken together weighed 500 pounds, or maybe a ton, or along there somewhere, but anyway it was hot weather, and by the time that a player had sent 35 of them home he was in a drench of perspiration and physically exhausted. Next we started cocked hat, that is to say a triangle of 3 pins, the other 7 being discarded. In this game we used the 3 smallest balls and kept on delivering them until we got the 3 pins down. After a day or 2 of practice we were able to get the chief pin with an output of 4 balls, but it cost us a great many deliveries to get the other 2. But by and by we succeeded in perfecting our art, at least we perfected it to our limit. We reached a scientific excellence where we could get the 3 pins down with 12 deliveries of the 3 small balls, making 36 shots to conquer the cocked hat. Having reached our limit for daylight work, we set up a couple of candles and played at night. As the alley was 50 or 60 feet long, we couldn't see the pins, but the candles indicated their locality. We continued this game until we were able to knock down the invisible pins with 36 shots. Having now reached the limit of the candle game, we changed and played it left-handed. We continued the left-handed game until we conquered its limit, which was 54 shots. Sometimes we sent down a succession of 15 balls without getting anything at all. We easily got out of that old alley 5 times the fun that anybody could have gotten out of the best alley in New York. One blazing hot day a modest and courteous officer of the regular army appeared in our den and introduced himself. He was about 35 years old, well-built and militarily erect and straight, and he was hermetically sealed up in the uniform of that ignorant old day, a uniform made of heavy material and much properer for January than July. When he saw the venerable alley, and glanced from that to the long procession of shining balls in the trough, his eye lit with desire, and we judged that he was our meat. We politely invited him to take a hand, and he could not conceal his gratitude, though his breeding and the etiquette of his profession made him try. We explained the game to him, and said that there were 41 balls, and that the player was privileged to extend his inning and keep on playing until he had used them all up, repeatedly, and that for every 10 strike he got a prize. We didn't name the prize. It wasn't necessary, as no prize would ever be needed or called for. He started a sarcastic smile, but quenched it, according to the etiquette of his profession. He merely regarded that he would like to select a couple of medium balls and 1 small one, adding that he didn't think he would need the rest. Then he began, and he was an astonished man. He couldn't get a ball to stay on the alley. When he had fired about 15 balls and hadn't yet reached the cluster of pins, his annoyance began to show out through his clothes. He wouldn't let it show in his face, but after another 15 balls he was not able to control his face. He didn't utter a word, but he exuded mute blasphemy from every pore. He asked permission to take off his coat, which was granted, and then he turned himself loose with bitter determination, and although he was only an infantry officer he could have been mistaken for a battery, he got up such a volleying thunder with those balls. Presently he removed his cravat. After a little he took off his vest, and still he went bravely on. Higgins was suffocating. My condition was the same, but it would not be courteous to laugh. It would be better to burst, and we came near it. That officer was good pluck. He stood to his work without uttering a word, and kept the balls going until he had expended the outfit 4 times, making 4 times 41 shots. Then he had to give it up, and he did, for he was no longer able to stand without wobbling. He put on his clothes, bade us a courteous good-bye, invited us to call at the fort, and started away. Then he came back and said, "What is the prize for the 10 strike?" We had to confess that we had not selected it yet. He said, gravely, that he thought there was no occasion for hurry about it. I believe Bateman's Alley was a better one than any other in America, in the matter of the essentials of the game. It compelled skill, it provided opportunity for bets, and if you could get a stranger to do the bowling for you, there was more and wholesomer and delightfuller entertainment to be gotten out of his industries than out of the finest game by the best expert and played upon the best alley elsewhere in existence. Mark Twain, to be continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, December 1907, chapters from my autobiography, Chapter 25, the final one, by Mark Twain. Prefatory note: Mr. Clemens began to write his autobiography many years ago, and he continues to add to it day by day. It was his original intention to permit no publication of his memoirs until after his death, but after leaving Pier No. 70, he concluded that a considerable portion might now suitably be given to the public. It is that portion, garnered from the 250,000 of words already written, which will appear in this review during the present year. No part of the autobiography will be published in book form during the lifetime of the author. Editor N.A.R. January 11, 1906. Answer to a letter received this morning. Dear Mrs. H., I am forever your debtor for reminding me of that curious passage in my life. During the first year or two after it happened, I could not bear to think of it. My pain and shame were so intense, and my sense of having been an imbecile so settled, established, and confirmed, that I drove the episode entirely from my mind. And so all these 28 or 29 years I have lived in the conviction that my performance of that time was coarse, vulgar, and destitute of humor. But your suggestion that you and your family found humor in it 28 years ago moved me to look into the matter. So I commissioned a Boston typewriter to delve among the Boston papers of that bygone time and send me a copy of it. It came this morning, and if there is any vulgarity about it, I am not able to discover it. If it isn't innocently and ridiculously funny, I am no judge. I will see to it that you get a copy. Address of Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain, from a report of the dinner given by the publishers of the Atlantic Monthly in honor of the 70th anniversary of the birth of John Greenleaf Whittier at the Hotel Brunswick, Boston, December 17, 1877, as published in the Boston Evening Transcript, December 18, 1877. Mr. Chairman, this is an occasion peculiarly meet for the digging up of pleasant reminiscences concerning literary folk. Therefore I will drop lightly into history myself. Standing here on the shore of the Atlantic, and contemplating certain of its largest literary billows, I am reminded of a thing which happened to me 13 years ago, when I had just succeeded in stirring up a little Nevadian literary puddle myself, whose spume flakes were beginning to blow thinly California-wards. I started an inspection tramp through the southern mines of California. I was callow and conceited, and I resolved to try the virtue of my nom de guerre. I very soon had an opportunity. I knocked at a miner's lonely log cabin in the foothills of the Sierra just at nightfall. It was snowing at the time. A jaded, melancholy man of 50, barefooted, opened the door to me. When he heard my nom de guerre, he looked more dejected than before. He let me in, pretty reluctantly, I thought, and after the customary bacon and beans, black coffee, and hot whiskey, I took a pipe. This resourceful man had not said 3 words up to this time. Now he spoke up and said, in the voice of one who is secretly suffering, "You're the 4th. I'm going to move." "The 4th what?" said I. "The 4th literary man that has been here in 24 hours. I'm going to move." "You don't tell me," said I. "Who were the others?" "Mr. Longfellow, Mr. Emerson, and Mr. Oliver Wendell Holmes." Consound the lot! You can easily believe I was interested. I supplicated. 3 hot whiskeys did the rest, and finally the melancholy miner began. Said he, "They came here just at dark yesterday evening, and I let 'em in, of course. Said they were going to the Yosemite. They were a rough lot, but that's nothing. Everybody looks rough that travels afoot. Mr. Emerson was a seedy little bit of a chap, red-headed. Mr. Holmes was as fat as a balloon. He weighed as much as 300, and had double chins all the way down to his stomach. Mr. Longfellow was built like a prize fighter. His head was cropped and bristly, like as if he had a wig made of hairbrushes. His nose lay straight down his face, like a finger with the end joint tilted up. They had been drinking, I could see that. And what queer talk they used! Mr. Holmes inspected this cabin, then he took me by the buttonhole, and says he, "Through the deep caves of thought I hear a voice that sings, 'Build thee more stately mansions, O my soul.' Says I can't afford it, Mr. Holmes, and moreover I don't want to." Blamed if I liked it pretty well, either, coming from a stranger that way. However, I started to get out my bacon and beans when Mr. Emerson came and looked on a while, and then he takes me aside by the buttonhole and says, "Give me agates for my meat, give me cantharids to eat, from air and ocean bring me foods, from all zones and altitudes." Says I, "Mr. Emerson, if you'll excuse me, this ain't no hotel." You see, it sort of riled me. I wasn't used to the ways of literary swells. But I went on a-sweating over my work, and next comes Mr. Longfellow and buttonholes me and interrupts me. Says he, "Honor be to Mudjekeewis, you shall hear how Powpequewis." But I broke in, and says I, "Beg your pardon, Mr. Longfellow, if you'll be so kind as to hold your yawp for about 5 minutes and let me get this grub ready, you'll do me proud." Well, sir, after they'd filled up, I set out the jug. Mr. Holmes looks at it, and then he fires up all of a sudden and yells, "Flash out a stream of blood-red wine, for I would drink to other days." By George, I was getting kind of worked up. I don't deny it, I was getting kind of worked up. I turns to Mr. Holmes, and says I, "Looky here, my fat friend, I'm a-running this shanty, and if the court knows herself, you'll take that whiskey straight or you'll go dry." Them's the very words I said to him. Now, I don't want to sass such famous literary folks, but you see they kind of forced me. There ain't nothing unreasonable about me. I don't mind a passel of guests a-treading on my tail 3 or 4 times, but when it comes to standing on it, it's different. And if the court knows herself, I says, you'll take whiskey straight or you'll go dry. Well, between drinks they'd swell around the cabin and strike attitudes and spout, and pretty soon they got out a greasy old deck and went to playing euchre at 10 cents a corner on trust. I began to notice some pretty suspicious things. Mr. Emerson dealt, looked at his hand, shook his head, and says, "I am the doubter and the doubt," and calmly bunched the hands and went to shuffling for a new layout. Says he, "They reckon ill who leave me out, they know not well the subtle ways I keep. I pass and deal again." Hanged if he didn't go ahead and do it, too. Oh, he was a cool one. Well, in about a minute things were running pretty tight, but all of a sudden I see Mr. Emerson's eye. He judged he had 'em. He had already corralled 2 tricks and each of the others one. So now he kind of lifts a little in his chair and says, "I tire of globes and aces. Too long the game is played." And down he fetched a right bower. Mr. Longfellow smiles as sweet as pie and says, Thanks to thee, my worthy friend, for the lesson thou hast taught." And blamed if he didn't down with another right bower. Emerson claps his hand on his bowie, Longfellow claps his on his revolver, and I went under a bunk. There was going to be trouble, but that monstrous Holmes rose up, wobbling his double chins, and says he, "Order, gentlemen. The first man that draws, I'll lay down on him and smother him." All quiet on the Potomac, you bet. They were pretty "how come you so" by now, and they begun to blow. Emerson says, "The nobbiest thing I ever wrote was Barbara Frietchie." Says Longfellow, "It don't begin with my Biglow Papers." Says Holmes, "My Thanopsis lays over 'em both. They mighty near ended in a fight. Then they wished they had some more company, and Mr. Emerson pointed to me and says, 'Is yonder squalid peasant all that this proud nursery could breed?' He was a-wetting his bowie on his boot, so I let it pass. Well, sir, next they took it into their heads that they would like some music, so they made me stand up and sing 'When Johnny Comes Marching Home,' till I dropped. at 13 minutes past 4 this morning. That's what I've been through, my friend. When I woke at 7, they were leaving, thank goodness, and Mr. Longfellow had my only boots on and his'n under his arm. Says I, 'Hold on there, Evangeline, what are you going to do with them?' He says, 'Going to make tracks with them, because lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing, leave behind us footprints on the sands of time.' As I said, Mr. Twain, you are the fourth in 24 hours, and I'm going to move. I ain't suited to a literary atmosphere." I said to the miner, "Why, my dear sir, these were not the gracious singers to whom we and the world pay loving reverence and homage. These were impostors." The miner investigated me with a calm eye for a while, then said he, "Ah, impostors, were they? Are you?" I did not pursue the subject, and since then I have not traveled on my nom de guerre enough to hurt. Such was the reminiscence I was moved to contribute, Mr. Chairman. In my enthusiasm I may have exaggerated the details a little, but you will easily forgive me that fault, since I believe it is the first time I have ever deflected from perpendicular fact on an occasion like this. What I have said to Mrs. H. is true. I did suffer during a year or two from the deep humiliations of that episode. But at last, in 1888, in Venice, my wife and I came across Mr. and Mrs. A. P. C. of Concord, Massachusetts, and a friendship began then of the sort which nothing but death terminates. The C.'s were very bright people, and in every way charming and companionable. We were together a month or two in Venice, and several months in Rome afterwards, and one day that lamented break of mine was mentioned. And when I was on the point of lathering those people for bringing it to my mind when I had gotten the memory of it almost squelched, I perceived with joy that the C.'s were indignant about the way that my performance had been received in Boston. They poured out their opinions most freely and frankly about the frosty attitude of the people who were present at that performance, and about the Boston newspapers for the position they had taken in regard to the matter. That position was that I had been irreverent beyond belief, beyond imagination. Very well, I had accepted that as a fact for a year or two, and had been thoroughly miserable about it whenever I thought of it, which was not frequently, if I could help it. Whenever I thought of it, I wondered how I ever could have been inspired to do so unholy a thing. Well, the C.'s comforted me, but they did not persuade me to continue to think about the unhappy episode. I resisted that. I tried to get it out of my mind and let it die, and I succeeded, until Mrs. H.'s letter came, and it had been a good 25 years since I had thought of that matter. And when she said that the thing was funny, I wondered if possibly she might be right. At any rate, my curiosity was aroused, and I wrote to Boston and got the whole thing copied as above set forth. I vaguely remember some of the details of that gathering. Dimly I can see 100 people, no, perhaps 50, shadowy figures sitting at tables, feeding, ghosts now to me, and nameless forevermore. I don't know who they were, but I can very distinctly see, seated at the grand table and facing the rest of us, Mr. Emerson, supernaturally grave, unsmiling; Mr. Whittier, grave, lovely, his beautiful spirit shining out of his face; Mr. Longfellow, with his silken white hair and his benignant face; Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, flashing smiles and affection and all good fellowship everywhere like a rose diamond whose facets are being turned towards the light, first one way and then another; a charming man, and always fascinating, whether he was talking or whether he was sitting still, what he would call still, but what would be more or less motion to other people. I can see those figures with entire distinctness across this abyss of time. One other feature is clear: Willie Winter, for these past 1,000 years dramatic editor of the New York Tribune, and still occupying that high post in his old age, was there. He was much younger then than he is now, and he showed it. It was always a pleasure to me to see Willie Winter at a banquet. During a matter of 20 years I was seldom at a banquet where Willie Winter was not also present, and where he did not read a charming poem written for the occasion. He did it this time, and it was up to standard. Dainty, happy, choicely phrased, and as good to listen to as music, and sounding exactly as if it was pouring unprepared out of heart and brain. Now at that point ends all that was pleasurable about that notable celebration of Mr. Whittier's 70th birthday, because I got up at that point and followed Winter with what I have no doubt I supposed would be the gem of the evening, the gay oration above quoted from the Boston paper. I had written it all out the day before and had perfectly memorized it, and I stood up there at my genial and happy and self-satisfied ease and began to deliver it. Those majestic guests, that row of venerable and still active volcanoes, listened, as did everybody else in the house, with attentive interest. Well, I delivered myself of, we'll say, the first 200 words of my speech. I was expecting no returns from that part of the speech, but this was not the case as regarded the rest of it. I arrived now at the dialogue. The old miner said, "You are the fourth. I'm going to move." "The fourth what?" said I. He answered, "The fourth literary man that has been here in 24 hours. I am going to move." "Why, you don't tell me," says I. "Who were the others?" "Mr. Longfellow, Mr. Emerson, Mr. Oliver Wendell Holmes sound the lot." Now then the house's attention continued, but the expression of interest in the faces turned to a sort of black frost. I wondered what the trouble was. I didn't know. I went on, but with difficulty. I struggled along and entered upon the miner's fearful description of the bogus Emerson, the bogus Holmes, the bogus Longfellow, always hoping, but with a gradually perishing hope, that somebody would laugh, or that somebody would at least smile, but nobody did. I didn't know enough to give it up and sit down. I was too new to public speaking, and so I went on with this awful performance and carried it clear through to the end in front of a body of people who seemed turned to stone with horror. It was the sort of expression their faces would have worn if I had been making these remarks about the Deity and the rest of the Trinity. There is no milder way in which to describe the petrified condition and the ghastly expression of those people. When I sat down it was with a heart which had long ceased to beat. I shall never be as dead again as I was then. I shall never be as miserable again as I was then. I speak now as one who doesn't know what the condition of things may be in the next world, but in this one I shall never be as wretched again as I was then. Howells, who was near me, tried to say a comforting word, but couldn't get beyond a gasp. There was no use. He understood the whole size of the disaster. He had good intentions, but the words froze before they could get out. It was an atmosphere that would freeze anything. If Benvenuto Cellini's salamander had been in that place, he would not have survived to be put into Cellini's Autobiography. There was a frightful pause. There was an awful silence, a desolating silence. Then the next man on the list had to get up. There was no help for it. That was Bishop. Bishop had just burst handsomely upon the world with a most acceptable novel, which had appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, a place which would make any novel respectable and any author noteworthy. In this case the novel itself was recognized as being, without extraneous help, respectable. Bishop was away up in the public favor, and he was an object of high interest. Consequently, there was a sort of a national expectancy in the air. We may say our American millions were standing, from Maine to Texas and from Alaska to Florida, holding their breath, their lips parted, their hands ready to applaud when Bishop should get up on that occasion and for the first time in his life speak in public. It was under these damaging conditions that he got up to "make good," as the vulgar say. I had spoken several times before, and that is the reason why I was able to go on without dying in my tracks, as I ought to have done. But Bishop had had no experience. He was up, facing those awful deities, facing those other people, those strangers, facing human beings for the first time in his life with a speech to utter. No doubt it was well packed away in his memory, no doubt it was fresh and usable until I had been heard from. I suppose that after that, and under the smothering pall of that dreary silence, it began to waste away and disappear out of his head, like the rags breaking from the edge of a fog, and presently there wasn't any fog left. He didn't go on. He didn't last long. It was not many sentences after his first before he began to hesitate and break and lose his grip, and totter and wobble, and at last he slumped down in a limp and mushy pile. Well, the program for the occasion was probably not more than one-third finished, but it ended there. Nobody rose. The next man hadn't strength enough to get up, and everybody looked so dazed, so stupefied, paralyzed, it was impossible for anybody to do anything, or even try. Nothing could go on in that strange atmosphere. Howells, mournfully and without words, hitched himself to Bishop and me and supported us out of the room. It was very kind. He was most generous. He towed us, tottering away, into some room in that building, and we sat down there. I don't know what my remark was now, but I know the nature of it. It was the kind of remark you make when you know that nothing in the world can help your case. But Howells was honest. He had to say the heartbreaking things he did say. There was no help for this calamity, this shipwreck, this cataclysm. This was the most disastrous thing that had ever happened in anybody's history, and then he added, "That is for you, and consider what you have done for Bishop. It is bad enough in your case. You deserve to suffer. You have committed this crime, and you deserve to have all you are going to get, but here is an innocent man. Bishop had never done you any harm, and see what you have done to him. He can never hold his head up again. The world can never look upon Bishop as being a live person. He is a corpse." That is the history of that episode of 28 years ago, which pretty nearly killed me with the shame during that first year or two whenever it forced its way into my mind. Now, then, I take that speech up and examine it. As I said, it arrived this morning from Boston. I have read it twice, and unless I am an idiot, it hasn't a single defect in it from the first word to the last. It is just as good can be. It is smart. It is saturated with humor. There isn't a suggestion of coarseness or vulgarity in it anywhere. What could have been the matter with that house? It is amazing, it is incredible, that they didn't shout with laughter, and those deities the loudest of them all. Could the fault have been with me? Did I lose courage when I saw those great men up there whom I was going to describe in such a strange fashion? If that happened, if I showed doubt, that can account for it, for you can't be successfully funny if you show that you are afraid of it. Well, I can't account for it, but if I had those beloved and revered old literary immortals back here now on the platform at Carnegie Hall, I would take that same old speech, deliver it word for word, and melt them till they'd run all over that stage. Oh, the fault must have been with me. It is not in the speech at all. Dictated October 3rd, 1907. In some ways I was always honest. Even from my earliest years I could never bring myself to use money which I had acquired in questionable ways. Many a time I tried, but principle was always stronger than desire. 6 or 8 months ago, Lieutenant General Nelson A. Miles was given a great dinner party in New York, and when he and I were chatting together in the drawing-room before going out to the dinner, he said, "I've known you as much as 30 years, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, that's about it, I think." He mused a moment or two, and then said, "I wonder we didn't meet in Washington in 1867. You were there at that time, weren't you?" I said, "Yes, but there was a difference. I was not known then. I had not begun to bud. I was an obscurity. But you had been adding to your fine Civil War record. You had just come back from your brilliant Indian campaign in the far West, and had been rewarded with a brigadier generalship in the regular army, and everybody was talking about you and praising you. If you had met me, you wouldn't be able to remember it now, unless some unusual circumstances of the meeting had burnt it into your memory. It is 40 years ago, and people don't remember nobodies over a stretch of time like that." I didn't wish to continue the conversation along that line, so I changed the subject. I could have proven to him without any trouble that we did meet in Washington in 1867, but I thought it might embarrass one or the other of us, so I didn't do it. I remember the incident very well. This was the way of it. I had just come back from the Quaker City excursion, and made a contract with Bliss of Hartford to write The Innocents Abroad. I was out of money, and went down to Washington to see if I could earn enough there to keep me in bread and butter while I should write the book. I came across William Clinton, brother of the astronomer, and together we invented a scheme for our mutual sustenance. We became the fathers and originators of what is a common feature in the newspaper world now, the syndicate. We became the old original first newspaper syndicate on the planet. It was on a small scale, but that is usual with untried new enterprises. We had 12 journals on our list. They were all weeklies, all obscure and poor, and all scattered far away among the back settlements. It was a proud thing for those little newspapers to have a Washington correspondence, and a fortunate thing for us that they felt in that way about it. Each of the 12 took 2 letters a week from us at $1 per letter. Each of us wrote 1 letter per week and sent off 6 duplicates of it to these benefactors, thus acquiring $24 a week to live on, which was all we needed in our cheap and humble quarters. Clinton was one of the dearest and loveliest human beings I have ever known, and we led a charmed existence together in a contentment which knew no bounds. Clinton was refined by nature and breeding. He was a gentleman by nature and breeding. He was highly educated. He was of a beautiful spirit. He was pure in heart and speech. He was a Scotchman and a Presbyterian of the old and genuine school, being honest and sincere in his religion, and loving it, and finding serenity and peace in it. He hadn't a vice, unless a large and grateful sympathy with Scotch whiskey may be called by that name. I didn't regard it as a vice, because he was a Scotchman, and Scotch whiskey to a Scotchman is as innocent as milk is to the rest of the human race. In Clinton's case it was a virtue, and not an economical one. $24 a week would really have been riches to us if we hadn't had to support that jug. Because of the jug we were always sailing pretty close to the wind, and any tardiness in the arrival of any part of our income was sure to cause us some inconvenience. I remember a time when a shortage occurred. We had to have $3, and we had to have it before the close of the day. I don't know now how we happened to want all that money at one time. I only know we had to have it. Clinton told me to go out and find it, and he said he would also go out and see what he could do. He didn't seem to have any doubt that we would succeed, but I knew that that was his religion working in him. I hadn't the same confidence. I hadn't any idea where to turn to raise all that bullion, and I said so. I think he was ashamed of me privately because of my weak faith. He told me to give myself no uneasiness, no concern, and said in a simple, confident, and unquestioning way, "The Lord will provide." I saw that he fully believed the Lord would provide, but it seemed to me that if he had had my experience but never mind that. Before he was done with me, his strong faith had had its influence, and I went forth from the place almost convinced that the Lord really would provide. I wandered around the streets for an hour, trying to think up some way to get that money, but nothing suggested itself. At last I lounged into the big lobby of the Ebbett House, which was then a new hotel, and sat down. Presently a dog came loafing along. He paused, glanced up at me, and said with his eyes, "Are you friendly?" I answered with my eyes that I was. He gave his tail a grateful little wag, and came forward and rested his jaw on my knee, and lifted his brown eyes to my face in a winningly affectionate way. He was a lovely creature, as beautiful as a girl, and he was made all of silk and velvet. I stroked his smooth brown head and fondled his drooping ears, and we were a pair of lovers right away. Pretty soon Brigadier General Miles, the hero of the land, came strolling by in his blue and gold splendors, with everybody's admiring gaze upon him. He saw the dog and stopped, and there was a light in his eye which showed that he had a warm place in his heart for dogs like this gracious creature. Then he came forward and patted the dog and said, "He is very fine. He is a wonder. Would you sell him?" I was greatly moved. It seemed a marvelous thing to me, the way Clinton's prediction had come true. I said, "Yes." The General said, "What do you ask for him?" $3. The General was manifestly surprised. He said, $3? Only $3? Why, that dog is a most uncommon dog. He can't possibly be worth less than 50. If he were mine I wouldn't take 100 for him. I'm afraid you are not aware of his value. Reconsider your price if you like. I don't wish to wrong you." But if he had known me, he would have known that I was no more capable of wronging him than he was of wronging me. I responded with the same quiet decision as before. "No, $3. That is his price." "Very well, since you insist upon it," said the General, and he gave me $3 and led the dog away and disappeared upstairs. In about 10 minutes a gentle-faced middle-aged gentleman came along and began to look around here and there and under tables and everywhere, and I said to him, "Is it a dog you are looking for?" His face was sad before and troubled, but it lit up gladly now, and he answered, "Yes, have you seen him?" "Yes," I said, "he was here a minute ago, and I saw him follow a gentleman away. I think I could find him for you if you would like me to try." I have seldom seen a person so grateful, and there was gratitude in his voice, too, when he conceded that he would like me to try. I said I would do it with great pleasure, but that, as it might take a little time, I hoped he would not mind paying me something for my trouble. He said he would do it most gladly, repeating that phrase most gladly, and asked me how much. I said, $3. He looked surprised and said, "Dear me, it is nothing. I will pay you 10 quite willingly." But I said, "No, 3 is the price," and I started for the stairs without waiting for any further argument, for Clinton had said that that was the amount that the Lord would provide, and it seemed to me that it would be sacrilegious to take a penny more than was promised. I got the number of the General's room from the office clerk as I passed by his wicket, and when I reached the room I found the General there caressing his dog and quite happy. I said, "I am sorry, but I have to take the dog again." He seemed very much surprised and said, "Take him again? Why, he is my dog. You sold him to me, and at your own price." "Yes," I said, "it is true, but I have to have him because the man wants him again." "What man?" "The man that owns him. He wasn't my dog." The General looked even more surprised than before, and for a moment he couldn't seem to find his voice, and then he said, "Do you mean to tell me that you were selling another man's dog and knew it?" "Yes, I knew it wasn't my dog." "Then why did you sell him?" I said, "Well, that is a curious question to ask. I sold him because you wanted him. You offered to buy the dog. You can't deny that. I was not anxious to sell him. I had not even thought of selling him. But it seemed to me that if it could be any accommodation to you—" He broke me off in the middle and said, "Accommodation to me? It is the most extraordinary spirit of accommodation I have ever heard of. The idea of your selling a dog that didn't belong to you—" I broke him off there and said, "There is no relevancy about this kind of argument. You said yourself that the dog was probably worth $100. I only asked you 3. Was there anything unfair about that? You offered to pay more, you know you did. I only asked you 3. You can't deny it." "Oh, what in the world has that to do with it? The crux of the matter is that you didn't own the dog. Can't you see that? You seem to think that there is no impropriety in selling property that isn't yours, provided you sell it cheap. Now then," I said, "please don't argue about it any more. You can't get around the fact that the price was perfectly fair, perfectly reasonable, considering that I didn't own the dog, and so arguing about it is only a waste of words. I have to have him back again because the man wants him. Don't you see that I haven't any choice in the matter? Put yourself in my place. Suppose you had sold a dog that didn't belong to you. Suppose you—" "Oh," he said, "don't muddle my brains any more with your idiotic reasonings. Take him along and give me a rest." So I paid back the $3 and led the dog downstairs and passed him over to his owner, and collected 3 for my trouble. I went away then with a good conscience because I had acted honorably. I never could have used the 3 that I sold the dog for, because it was not rightly my own, but the 3 I got for restoring him to his rightful owner was righteously and properly mine because I had earned it. That man might never have gotten that dog back at all if it hadn't been for me. My principles have remained to this day what they were then. I was always honest. I know I can never be otherwise. It is, as I said in the beginning, I was never able to persuade myself to use money which I had acquired in questionable ways. Now then, that is the tale. Some of it is true. Mark Twain. End of chapters from my autobiography, by Mark Twain.